Good evening, my friends. It is September 3rd, 2025, here in London, where the air tonight carries both the scent of autumn rain and the memory of a city once obsessed with appearances. The grand stone facades of Mayfair and Belgravia still stand, their windows reflecting the lamplight, but they hold secrets that history long tried to bury. The story we are about to enter begins not with triumph, but with scandal. In the final years of Queen Victoria's reign, the polished image of the aristocracy cracked, and beneath it was revealed a hidden world of desires that shocked the public and shook the credibility of Britain's ruling class. By the 1890s, diaries, letters, and testimonies began to surface. Some whispered in courtrooms, others leaked to an eager press. Dukes who once lectured on morality were discovered visiting private chambers filled with velvet, drapes, and masks. Countesses who graced the front pages of etiquette manuals were found keeping coded journals, describing clandestine encounters with companions far outside their rank. The hypocrisy was overwhelming. The very people who defined propriety in Victorian society were the same who indulged in secret obsessions that no law of the time could openly acknowledge. To understand how this collapse of reputation unfolded, we must step back to the earlier decades of the 19th century. London was swelling with wealth from empire. Aristocratic families, flush with fortunes from India, Africa, and the Caribbean, paraded themselves as examples of virtue and restraint. The public saw impeccable gowns, glittering banquets, and stiff ceremonies of etiquette. Yet, behind the heavy curtains of their mansions, other gatherings were taking place. Private clubs with exotic names, like the Cannibal Club, hosted intellectuals and lords who mingled discussion of anthropology with performances that blurred the lines of scholarship and fantasy. In other houses, collections of forbidden art circulated, depicting scenes far from the polite ideals of marriage and family. Women of rank, confined by the iron rules of cassettes and endless lessons in propriety, also lived double lives. Some wrote diaries that today lie in archives, their pages filled with a strange mix of restraint and rebellion. A duchess might describe the ache of her corset, only to end the entry with a confession of a stolen moment with a footman. Rumors spread of secret salons in Kensington, where noble women, free from the eyes of their husbands, explored roles and desires considered unthinkable in public life. Lace and chains, etiquette and disobedience, these contradictions defined the private lives of many who appeared the most respectable. The facade began to crumble in the 1880s and 1890s. A servant dismissed in anger might reveal what he had seen in the night. A mistress, abandoned without payment, might sell letters to a journalist. Court cases, cloaked in vague phrases like immoral conduct, hinted at truths more damning than the words admitted. A baron stood accused of financing secret brothels. A viscount's letters, written in code but cracked by the curious, revealed liaisons with courtesans whose names were known across London. Each revelation chipped away at the myth of moral superiority that the aristocracy had cultivated so carefully. What remains most striking today is not simply the fact of indulgence, but the scale of repression that surrounded it. Victorian society demanded purity, but it was a purity enforced by shame and secrecy. The aristocracy, with their wealth and access, hid their indulgences better than most, but they could not conceal them forever. When the scandals emerged, they did not destroy the empire directly, yet they left a scar on the public memory, a reminder that the guardians of virtue were often its most daring violators. The legacy of these scandals is paradoxical. On one hand, they revealed the hypocrisy of a class that ruled with lectures on morality. On the other, their hidden explorations recorded in art, literature, and rumor fed into the broader culture of Britain, the late Victorian fascination. With repression and desire shaped novels, plays, and social debates that continued into the 20th century. To study these scandals is not merely to gawk at salacious tales, but to understand the deeper truth that a society which demands silence about desire often creates the most elaborate theaters for it. So tonight, as we begin this story, let us walk through the drawing rooms, the private clubs, the velvet-draped chambers of Victorian London. We will uncover not only what the aristocracy did in secret, but also why their world was so carefully built on contradiction. Don't forget to subscribe to support this journey and follow along for the next chapters. The rain had ended just before dusk, and London smelled of wet stone and horse sweat. Gas lamps clicked alive along the Strand, their glass chimneys trembling with a faint hiss. In the windows of Fleet Street, the printers were already at work, and the presses gave a heavy breath each time a sheet took ink. Newsboys waited with damp caps in their hands. They knew a storm was inside those buildings, not of weather, but of words. At the royal courts of justice, the arches held a penumbra that swallowed footsteps. The floor was a mosaic of muddy shoeprints, the air a blend of coal smoke and old paper. Clerks murmured, barristers tugged their cuffs, and somewhere behind the paneled walls a bell rang with a tired dignity. Here the empire showed its civility, but tonight's civility felt like a costume borrowed for a single performance. A clerk lifted a leather folder, and the room grew still. He had in his keeping the letters that would become the ruin of those who once lectured the nation on virtue. Edwin Harrow of the Pall Mall Gazette stood near the back, his notebook against his coat to keep the paper dry from the steam of bodies. He had seen many scandals pass, like summer showers, loud and brief. What he saw now had the cold persistence of winter rain. The names written in the folder were not substitutes or hints. They were the real thing. A duke whose charity fairs had filled the rotunda at the Albert Hall, a countess who had instructed schoolgirls in modesty and deportment, a viscount whose speeches against indecency had stirred applause in the House of Lords. All three were threaded through the letters by a discreet hand that favored watercolor ink, and a row of small stars at the bottom of each page. Their first letter was read without adjectives. It described a room in Mayfair, velvet curtains that shut out the street noise, a painting of a shepherdess that had never seen a field. The words did not name acts. They did not need to. The letter asked for a certain arrangement of time and company, and it promised discretion with a confidence that only old money knows. When the clerk reached the signature, A murmur moved through the court like a draft under a door. The title that closed the page had appeared many times in charity lists and in printed sermons on household morality. Edwin looked to the gallery. There were women with perfumed gloves and men with polished boots. There were servants too, their hands cracked from winter work, standing because no space had been left for them to sit. Among them he saw Thomas Bell, a coachman whose employment had ended with a suddenness that suggested more than poor driving. Bell held his cap against his chest and stared at the wooden rail. He breathed through his mouth as if the room lacked air, or as if he wished to breathe a different air altogether, one made of London fog and not of judgment. The court adjourned before darkness fully settled, but its residue remained in every throat. Outside, the city exhaled. Carriage wheels cut brown crescents through puddles. In the public houses, men stirred their beer with the absent motion of those who listen more than they speak. A woman at a corner stand sold roasted chestnuts. The shells cracked, the steam rose sweet and smoky, and the sound of snapping shells felt indecently loud, as if the city had become too alert to small noises. By 9, the first broadsheets began to appear. Edwin watched the boys run with bundles pressed to their ribs. They shouted words that skirted the edge of libel, words that promised both outrage and satisfaction. On the steps of St. Clement Danes, a man read a headline under the tremble of a lamp and shook his head with the weariness of one who had expected this and still felt the sting. He folded the paper, tucked it into his coat, and walked on as if the pavement itself had shifted. In Grosvenor Square, a certain mansion remained. Dark, the iron railing shone with moisture, and the fountain hummed with an even fall of water. Inside the entrance hall, a portrait of a hunting party faced a clock with a porcelain dial. The housekeeper, Mrs. Judd, moved like a ghost between carpets that held the smell of beeswax and old lavender. She paused by the library door, closed it, and placed her palm against the wood as if it could return a message. She had served here since the year of the Queen's Jubilee. She had polished the silver for dinners that fed to dozen titled mouths. Tonight she felt the house grow heavy and still, the way a house grows still when illness enters and the family speaks in whispers. Upstairs, Lady Evelyn Ashburn sat with a diary that she would not open. The book had a ribbon that matched the blue of a dress she never wore in public. She listened to the rainwater settle on the sash and to the far sound of a carriage drawing away. In the grate a log cracked and sent a small scatter of sparks to the hearth. She thought of the garden at daybreak when roses fainted at the edges with dew, and the gardener hummed a song that had no words. She thought of her husband, who had taught the city to speak about restraint with a tone of moral music. She remembered his speeches, the careful cadence, the slight tilt of his head in the Parliament lights. She pressed her fingertips to the paper and felt the tooth of it, the dry resistance. And she wondered what the paper would take from her if she began to write the truth. On Piccadilly, the smoke from the clubs drifted into the night like a cologne of money and habit. Inside the Athenaeum, a colonel laid down his fork and said to no one in particular that society would correct itself, that a few bad apples could not spoil a harvest. The waiter, who had a mother in Lambeth and two sisters at a hat factory, smiled without letting his eyes meet the Colonel's. He moved between tables with a skill born of watching men pretend. They did not know one another when the conversation required it. In another room, a judge read a page of Cicero and pretended that Latin could close a door. That English had opened. The city itself seemed to turn its face. The statues along surmise looked away with their stone eyes. The river took the light of bridges and broke it into restless fragments. In Wapping, a lighterman drank tea served thick and black, and asked the room if a lord bled any different from a dockworker. No one answered him. They listened to the clock near the bar and to the small tremor of the window whenever a cart went by. What had broken was not a single name, but a system of belief. The aristocracy had taught the nation to believe that discipline lived in their blood like an inheritance. They had held up marriage as a citadel and chastity as a lamp at its gate. Now the letters lay in a clerk's hands, and those hands smelled of iron gall ink and lawful authority. The empire still flew its flags, and the regiments still marched with brass that flashed in the sun. Yet the moral flag had slipped from its pole, and it lay in a puddle where even a careful foot would splash it. Edwin walked home along Fleet Street with the slow steps of a man who does not want to reach his door. He thought of his own small rooms near Holborn, the kettle with its dented side, the book of sermons his mother had left him. He thought of the first time he had watched a minister walk out of a house by a back door at dawn. He remembered the wet grass and the minister's white collar that looked gray in morning light. He had not written that story. He had kept it for his conscience. Tonight he felt that private restraint die a quiet death. It was not triumph. It was something closer to sorrow. The kind of sorrow one feels when the mask breaks and you see that the face underneath is not a monster and not a saint, only a human face with the lines of ordinary weakness. He stopped at a bridge and watched the water carry a crooked raft of leaves. The smell here was different, thick with tar and the cold iron of the rail. He folded his notebook into his pocket and lifted his head to the wind. Behind him the city spoke with 1,000 voices at once. Some voices demanded punishment. Some asked for mercy. Some wanted only the entertainment that scandal provides. Edwin thought of Lady Evelyn's unturned page, of Mrs. Judd's palm on the library door, of Thomas Bell with his cap pressed to his chest. He thought of the Duke who might be packing a valise even now, and of the Countess who might be kneeling at a bed that had seen too much silence. The night deepened, and London went on with its work. Trains hammered their way out of the stations. With sparks in the dark, milkmen slept for their early rounds. Somewhere a child woke and cried, and was hushed with a lullaby that had crossed more than one ocean. The empire still breathed, steady and powerful. Yet in the spaces between breaths, there was a new sound, quiet but insistent, like the tick of a watch that has just been wound. It was the sound of a story that would not stay buried. It would glide through drawing rooms and along alleyways. It would settle on mantelpieces beside silver trophies and on kitchen shelves beside chipped cups. In the morning, the papers would be everywhere, and the city would taste the sharp ink on its tongue. What had broken could not be mended with a single apology or a single lawsuit. It would live as a shadow on the polished floor of every grand house and as a thought in the mind of every clerk who took a sworn statement. It would remind the nation that virtue preached is not virtue proved. And under that reminder lay a deeper truth that does not change with fashions or flags. Wherever desire is forced into silence, it will build its own theater, and sooner or later the curtain will be pulled aside. The smell of coal dust lingered in the narrow lanes of Holborn, mixing with the sharper scent of ink and damp paper. It was the 1870s, and London had grown into a city that could not keep its secrets. The empire's heart throbbed with 1,000,000 footsteps, and the streets bore witness to the contradictions of the age. The polished carriages of dukes, rattling past barefoot children, sermons on restraint printed beside advertisements for perfumed powders and exotic wines. In such an atmosphere, scandal was not an accident waiting to happen, it was an inevitability. The first and most immediate cause lay in the servants, those silent watchers of aristocratic life. They polished silver until their reflections stared back. They carried letters with seals still warm from wax, and they moved through corridors where the lords and ladies believed themselves unseen. For decades, discretion had been purchased with wages and threats, but wages did not always arrive, and threats grew stale when repeated too often. Dismissal was common, kindness rare. By the 1860s, a servant turned away with no references carried more than hunger in his belly. He carried stories that could be sold. Thomas Bell, once a coachman for Lord Ashburn, knew the bitter taste of dismissal. His hands, scarred by rains and frost, had guided the family carriage through fog and frost alike. Yet a single rumor of unreliability cast him out. He told his tale not in anger, but in survival. First to a neighbor in Lambeth, then to a man who worked at the press. Soon his words mingled with others, like tributaries feeding a river, and the current grew strong enough to carry secrets far from the grand houses where they had been born. The second cause was the courtesans themselves, figures both admired and despised, who moved through the city's twilight with a grace that belied their peril. They were once kept in silken apartments, supplied with gowns from Bond Street and dinners from Piccadilly's finest kitchens. But such comfort depended on the constancy of patrons, and constancy was the one virtue the aristocracy could seldom offer. When fortunes turned or affections cooled, these women were cast adrift. Some vanished into poverty. Others, more cunning or more desperate, carried letters, gifts, and secrets to the editors of newspapers eager for sensation. Their voices, long silenced in public life, emerged in print with a vengeance. The press was the third and most decisive, cause by mid-century, newspapers had become engines of both information and entertainment. Steam-powered presses, rolling through the night with the smell of hot metal and oil, poured out thousands of sheets by dawn. Men like W.T. Stead understood that scandal sold faster than sermons. His campaign against child exploitation in the 1880s had shown that the public craved moral outrage, especially when aristocratic names were involved. Journalists learned to cultivate informants among servants, mistresses, and even clerks in the courts. An overheard conversation in a coffee house, a discarded letter at the post, or a whispered confession in exchange for coin all became fodder for headlines. The moral laws of the age played their own paradoxical part. In 1857, the Obscene Publications Act sought to cleanse literature of indecency. Brothels were raided, theaters censored, novels suppressed, yet every act of repression sharpened curiosity. The more Parliament preached purity, the more Londoners suspected corruption beneath the robes and coronets. The aristocracy themselves, in drafting and supporting such laws, built cages that they alone possessed the keys to escape. Behind heavy curtains and locked chambers they indulged, believing the law could not touch them, but the very existence of those laws meant that any exposure, no matter how small, carried the weight of criminality and disgrace. Consider the Cannibal Club, founded in the 1860s by men of rank and scholarship. Officially, it studied anthropology and the customs of distant peoples. In truth, its meetings often blurred into theatrical performances, masked entertainments, and rituals borrowed less from science than from imagination. At first, the public knew nothing. But when a servant spoke of strange costumes and unsettling tableaux, and when an artist's sketch found its way to a printer's shop, the whispers began. Soon the name Cannibal Club was spoken in taverns with a wink and a shudder. What had been intended as private amusement became a symbol of hypocrisy, proof that those who lectured on civilization's superiority practiced uncivilized delights. Behind closed doors, economic change also played its part. The rise of a prosperous middle class, armed with education and ambition, meant that the aristocracy no longer stood unchallenged. Bankers, merchants, and factory owners had fortunes that rivaled dukes. Yet they were excluded from the old world of titles. For them, every aristocratic scandal was a vindication. Each downfall proved that honor was not tied to bloodlines, but to conduct. The hunger of this class for stories of hypocrisy created a ready audience for the newspapers. What once would have been whispered in a drawing room now echoed across the city in bold type. The immediate causes then were not isolated sparks, but a tangle of forces. Servants seeking justice, courtesans seeking survival, journalists seeking profit, and a society straining under its own contradictions. Together they formed a web so taut that a single tug could bring the whole fabric down. By the late 1870s, that fabric was fraying. Every dismissal of a maid, every unpaid mistress, every overheard conversation became a loose thread waiting to be pulled. And London, a city that prided itself on discipline and order, was soon to watch its most respected names unravel in public view. In retrospect, it is almost astonishing that the aristocracy did not foresee the danger. Perhaps they believed their world too insulated, their money too vast, their titles too venerable. But even marble statues crack when weathered by rain. The rain in this case was steady. The ink of the press, the hunger of the dismissed, the fury of the betrayed. By the time the great scandals erupted in the 1890s, the causes had been gathering for decades, like thunder building behind a still horizon. And so, the stage was set. The curtain had not yet risen, but the audience was restless. The aristocracy continued to dine beneath chandeliers and pose for portraits in velvet gowns, unaware or perhaps unwilling to admit that their every gesture was now watched, recorded, and ready to be sold. The empire's grandeur would remain, but its guardians had already begun to lose the one treasure they could not purchase back: the belief in their own moral superiority. The year was 1885, and London lay under a heavy fog that turned the gas lamps into pale halos. In Fleet Street, presses beat like iron hearts, pouring out papers that smelled of hot ink and damp rag. What they carried that winter was not the usual chatter of Parliament or trade, but fragments of a story that would twist itself around every drawing room and tavern. It began with paper, as so many Victorian scandals did. Letters written in codes, journals bound in leather, testimonies whispered before judges who frowned more at the inconvenience than at the content. The aristocracy had always believed their words were safe, but words are treacherous things. The first document to stir real alarm came from a clerk in Chancery Lane. He had discovered correspondence between Viscount Harland and a woman who called herself Lucia. The letters were filled with metaphors of flowers and music, but the clerk recognized patterns. Each mention of lilies referred to meetings at a rented house near Russell Square. Each mention of violins signaled the presence of more than two people. At the bottom of each page, Harland had drawn a star in blue ink, a small vanity that betrayed his hand. The clerk, perhaps out of conscience, perhaps for coin, passed copies to a journalist. Within weeks, whispers turned into print. Soon after, another blow fell. A diary belonging to Lady Margaret Doncaster surfaced during a family dispute. She had kept it locked in a chest beneath folded gowns, believing its brass key a shield. Yet the key was found, and the pages, once perfumed faintly with lavender, were read aloud in a solicitor's office. She described gatherings in Kensington, where women of rank met without their husbands. They exchanged not only confidences, but embraces, sometimes with companions of their own sex. One entry spoke of a velvet chamber where curtains muffled every sound. When portions of this diary reached the public, they struck like lightning. That the guardians of domestic virtue, the very models of wifely modesty, indulged in such secret lives, shook society to its roots. The scandal might still have been contained. If not for the testimony of servants, they had nothing to lose and everything to gain. A butler dismissed without reference described seeing lords in costume. Their masks slipped as the candles burned low. A maid recounted the strange packages she was sent to deliver: silken cords, odd mirrors, painted fans. Each testimony added weight until the rumors became impossible to ignore. The servants had been invisible for too long. Now their voices rang with the force of truth, and the public believed them more than the aristocrats who tried to deny. What made this period the true turning point was not just the revelations themselves, but their circulation. In the past, gossip had traveled by word of mouth, dissolving after a few weeks. Now it traveled by print, multiplied by thousands of copies, read in coffee houses where men stirred their tea slowly as they whispered. and in parlors where women pretended to frown while their eyes glittered with hunger for detail. The fog of London no longer concealed secrets it carried them. Viscount Harland, confronted in Parliament, dismissed the charges as inventions of malicious scribblers. Yet he did not appear in public for months. Lady Margaret retired to the countryside, where her windows remained shuttered, though neighbors claimed they heard her piano late at night. Other names appeared and vanished, some perhaps unfairly, others all too guilty. What remained constant was the sense that the aristocracy could no longer shield itself. The irony was bitter. For decades, these men and women had written the laws of morality, punishing others for far lesser sins. They had demanded purity of the poor while practicing indulgence themselves. Now their own writings, their diaries, their letters, their careless codes were turned against them. The pen that had once elevated them was now the blade that cut them down. Among the public, reactions varied. Some felt only glee at the spectacle of the mighty brought low. Others felt sorrow, as if a parent had been unmasked before a child. Many felt anger, not only at the deeds themselves, but at the hypocrisy that had concealed them. And in every reaction lay the recognition that something had shifted. The aristocracy had lost its immunity. The illusion of their moral superiority, once as solid as stone, now seemed as fragile as paper. On a foggy evening in December, Edwin Harrow, the journalist who had pursued the story from the start, walked along the embankment. The river lapped darkly against its walls, and the lamps gave only a faint circle of light. He thought of the letters and diaries, of the servants' words, of the noble faces now painted in ridicule. He wondered whether truth was ever pure, or whether all truth came stained by the motives of those who revealed it. Yet one fact remained: the aristocracy, so long the teachers of virtue, had been caught as pupils of vice. The turning point had come, and with it, the certainty that nothing would ever be quite the same again. The winter of 1886 carried a bitterness that was not only of weather. The frost lay silver upon rooftops. The Thames rolled sluggish and black beneath its crust of ice. And yet the cold that most Londoners felt came from a different source: the sudden collapse of trust in those who claimed to lead. The scandals of the aristocracy had become more than tales of private folly. They had entered the bloodstream of the nation, and everywhere one walked, from tavern to drawing room, the talk was of hypocrisy unveiled. In the public houses of Whitechapel, labourers drank their porter and slapped the newspapers with calloused hands. They preached to us about discipline, one said, his voice roughened by years at the docks. And look what they do with their evenings. The men around him nodded, not with surprise, but with the grim satisfaction of having long suspected. What they now heard confirmed: a young apprentice, his cheeks red with coal soot, muttered that if a lord could keep two mistresses and still speak of Christian virtue, then a common man could at least be forgiven a pint too many. Laughter followed, sharp and tired. The laughter of men who understood injustice, but had little power to mend it. Meanwhile, in the drawing rooms of Kensington and Belgravia, ladies who once competed over etiquette now competed in veiled allusions to fallen countesses. They spoke in low voices, fans fluttering like restless birds. Some claimed sympathy, insisting that women confined by cassettes and duties deserved small rebellions. Others whispered scorn, eager to distance themselves from disgrace. Servants, silent as ever, moved among them with trays of tea, their eyes lowered but their ears sharp. They carried the gossip downstairs, where it lost its veil and grew teeth. Within days, the same story might be retold in a tavern, stripped of delicacy, until it returned to the very papers the ladies themselves pretended not to read. The press thrived in this atmosphere. Printers labored late into the night, their machines hammering like cannons. Each edition promised new revelations. Each headline teased with hints of names still concealed. For every aristocrat disgraced, another waited in the shadows of rumor. Papers sold by the thousands, bought by readers who felt both moral outrage and secret delight. The scandal became a mirror, reflecting not only the sins of the few, but also the hunger of the many. Reformers seized the moment. Preachers thundered from pulpits that the decay of the upper class was a sign of divine displeasure. Pamphleteers argued that the aristocracy, already weakened by debt and indolence, was unfit to guide a modern empire. In Parliament, radical voices demanded more accountability, citing the scandals as proof that birth was no guarantee of virtue. Among the middle class, bankers and merchants, men who had made their fortunes in railways and trade, saw opportunity. Every lord exposed made room for a new man of business to rise in influence. The fall of old reputations was the ladder of new ambitions. Even within the aristocracy, divisions deepened. Some families withdrew into silence, closing their great houses and retreating to the countryside. Others clung stubbornly to society, attending every ball and dinner as if to defy gossip with their presence. But the mask had cracked. A lady's smile might still glitter under chandeliers, yet behind it lay fear that tomorrow's paper would carry her name. The men, once so certain of their privilege, now felt the tremor of suspicion even in the halls of the House of Lords. Beyond London, the reverberations spread. In Manchester, factory workers read about lords in velvet chambers, while their own children shivered in threadbare coats. In Glasgow, preachers cited the scandals as warnings against the corruption of wealth. Across the empire, from Calcutta to Cape Town, colonial officials whispered of the hypocrisy of a nation that lectured others on civilization. While its rulers wallowed in secret vice, the moral authority of Britain, already strained by conflicts abroad, suffered wounds at home. And yet, amid the anger and the gossip, there was also fascination. The details, velvet curtains, coded letters, secret salons became part of the city's imagination. Artists sketched caricatures. Playwrights drafted comedies to bold for the stage but shared in private. Even as society condemned, it consumed. The scandals revealed not only the frailty of the aristocracy, but the appetite of the nation itself. For stories of forbidden lives taught in a modest house near Clerkenwell, Edwin Harrow sat at his desk, his lamp casting a pool of yellow light upon scattered clippings. He listened to the faint hum of the city beyond his window, the rumble of carts, the cry of a distant newsboy, the barking of a dog in some unseen alley. He thought of the voices he had heard, the bitterness of dock workers, the whisper of ladies behind their fans, the thunder of preachers, the ambition of merchants. All were joined by the echo of scandal, as if a single stone had been thrown into a great pond and the ripples had reached every shore. Edwin dipped his pen and wrote a line that he knew might never be published. The aristocracy has lost its innocence, and with it, the empire has lost its illusion. He paused, listening to the scratching of the nib, and wondered if nations, like men, could survive the collapse of their own myths. The reverberations had begun, and they would not be silenced. The streets of London in the early 1890s were alive with contradictions. On the one hand, the empire stood at its zenith, its flag unfurled across continents, its navy a chain of iron upon the seas. On the other hand, at the very center of this proud dominion, faith in its ruling class had begun to wither. The scandals of the aristocracy, once whispered in corridors and denied with raised brows, now lay open to the gaze of millions. The city still bustled, the trains still thundered, the factories still smoked, but beneath it all ran a new current of suspicion. The illusion of moral superiority had fractured, and a people once willing to bow their heads in reverence now lifted their eyes with skepticism. Walking along the embankment one evening, Edwin Harrow watched the lamps flicker against the mist. He thought of the documents he had read, the testimonies he had heard, the faces of men and women once painted in solemn portraits, but now described in columns of scandal. The air smelled of coal smoke and river mud, sharp and unclean. A cold breeze lifted his collar, and he tightened his coat. He could not help but ask himself what it meant for a nation, when those who governed preached one life yet lived another. Was hypocrisy the inevitable price of power, or was it the beginning of decline? Such reflections did not belong to Edwin. Alone, across the empire, ordinary men and women wrestled with the same questions. In Birmingham, a machinist paused from polishing brass to remark that the Queen herself could not silence gossip about her lords. In Dublin, a teacher explained to his pupils that rulers were merely men and women, prone to weakness like all. In Edinburgh, a group of reformers passed around newspapers as evidence that Britain's true strength lay no longer in hereditary titles, but in the rising merit of commerce and industry. The scandals had become more than stories of desire. They had become lessons in power and its fragility. Among the aristocracy, silence was often louder than speech. In shuttered country estates, noble families dined at long tables, where conversation faltered, each guest uncertain who might be the next subject of revelation. Portraits of ancestors, warriors, statesmen, benefactors stared down from walls, their painted eyes offering no counsel. The candles burned with steady flames, but the atmosphere was brittle, as though one careless word might shatter it. Some aristocrats clung to denial, declaring the stories inventions of a jealous press. Others, more honest, admitted quietly to friends that their class had built its reputation on a fourwade too thin to withstand the weight of reality. The wider society began to reflect upon the deeper truth that repression breeds duplicity. By demanding silence about desire, Victorian morality had created the very theaters where secrecy thrived. Every corset tightened, every sermon preached, every law passed against indecency only increased the hunger to transgress. And when those who made such rules were discovered in violation, the damage was double both to their honor and to the legitimacy of the system they upheld. Edwin pondered this paradox in his small flat near Holborn. He kept on his desk not only newspapers, but also the diary of his mother, who had lived a life of modest dignity. Her words were plain, speaking of bread prices, illness, and Sunday hymns, yet they carried an honesty absent from the gilded letters of lords. He realized then that the true difference between classes was not virtue, but visibility. The poor sinned openly, punished swiftly; the rich sinned privately, punished only when exposure made silence impossible. Hypocrisy was the luxury of the privileged as dawn broke one morning, pale and reluctant. Edwin walked across Westminster Bridge. The river below gleamed like tarnished silver, and gulls cried in the grey air. He thought of the empire stretching outward, of ships departing for India, of soldiers drilling in Aldershot. Britain still projected strength to the world, but he knew that power begins to weaken when its own people lose faith. The scandals of the aristocracy were not merely stories of desire. They were warnings that the trust between ruler and ruled, once broken, is the hardest thing to repair. For us today, more than a century later, the story feels familiar. We too live in a world where leaders preach one thing and practice another, where the private lives of the powerful collide with the expectations of the public. Technology has changed the broadsheet, has given way to the screen, but the pattern endures. Hypocrisy, once revealed, erodes authority as surely in the 21st century as it did in the 19th. The broken facade of Victorian London is thus not an artifact but a mirror. And so the chapter closes, not with the fall of a single duke or countess, but with the recognition that no title, no fortune, no empire can forever conceal the truth of human contradiction. The aristocracy fell not because of their desires, but because of their pretense of purity. In the end, it was their masks that betrayed them. If you are still awake, press 1 in the comments. The house is still stand. Pale facades along Park Lane and in the squares of Mayfair look out with an expression that time has learned to keep. Their windows are polished. Their iron railings are black and cold. Tourists pass with umbrellas and do not know that behind those panes a century ago the city kept a second life. The doorbells are brass. The steps smell faintly of damp stone. A carriage might appear in the mind almost by habit. One can imagine the sound of hooves soft against the rain, and a figure slipping through a side entrance where the lantern burns low. The outcome came first. That is how this period should be remembered. In the last years of the century, the newspapers no longer wrote in riddles. They printed inventories that had escaped from a solicitor's case. They printed fragments of letters and small drawings from an unpaid artist, whose memory was too sharp for comfort. A viscount's creditor forced the counting of goods. The ledger that listed mirrors and lamps and screens found its way to Fleet Street. It named a dozen masks made of satin. It noted a set of lamps covered in crimson silk. It described a room that held nothing for reading and everything for looking. The city read and felt the shiver that comes when a fear is confirmed. Ladies who kept books of etiquette turned the page and saw a reflection that did not belong to them. Shopmen who stood all day under gaslight nodded with a tired kind of satisfaction. The poor had been told for 2 generations that salvation lay in restraint. Now they saw that those who wrote the sermons had arranged their evenings with a different grammar. The aristocracy did not fall from power in a single night. Their titles remained, and their estates were managed by careful hands. Yet the bland surface of reverence cracked. What poured through the crack was not only gossip, it was the knowledge that a performance had ended. Walk with me into one of these houses in the imagination. After the scandal, but before the furniture has been removed, the hall smells of beeswax and old lavender. On the console stands a bust of a Roman whose name no one in the house can pronounce. A portrait of a hunting party watches from the staircase. The first rooms are as the world expects. A piano near the window, a table with silver for tea, books unread but chosen with taste. Then there is a corridor with a door that hardly opens in daylight. Inside, the air is heavy with a sweet smoke that has traveled from far ports. Drapes drink the sound of the street. Mirrors stand opposite one another and turn a single flame into a procession of candles. The sofas are deep. The lamps cast a red that softens every edge. The room has learned to close the mouth of the city dot by the time these rooms were known. In the papers, they were already empty, yet their emptiness became part of the outcome. Owners fled to the countryside and left their staff to pack silence into trunks. Carpets were rolled, screens were folded. A footman carried a parcel that held nothing worse than silk. Yet he lifted it as if it could accuse him. The housekeeper made an inventory with a hand that had once been steady. She paused over a word and then wrote the safer one. The maid who had guarded the red door stood in the yard and watched the smoke rise from the kitchen. She thought of the sound that drapery makes when it falls back into place, and she decided never to speak of it. Names were not always printed, but London seldom needed names to complete a picture. A judge in the club on Pall Mall folded his newspaper, took a spoonful of pudding, and declared that the nation would correct itself. A colonel agreed because agreement was his habit. A waiter filled glasses and thought of his mother in Lambeth and the girl who sewed hats in the room above hers. Outside the club, a newsboy called the headline, and the cry sounded like a stone thrown in water. The circles would widen through the night. Edwin Harrow read proofs that smelled of hot metal and oil, and knew that a certain line could not be printed. He walked to the embankment and watched the river take light from the bridges and cut it into pieces. He had learned the names long before he wrote about the rooms. He had sat in parlors where respectable women argued that vice belonged only to the poor. He had stood at the edge of a charity ball and watched a man praised as a pillar of moral order touch the hand of a dancer with a practiced secrecy. When the proofs were done, he went home by way of Chancery Lane. Somewhere a piano was trying to remember a tune. The note wavered and died. The result reached the countryside as well. Blinds were drawn in houses with deer parks and long drives. Letters were written to cousins asking for time abroad. A carriage was ordered for the morning that would take no luggage with crests. Servants had questions that no one answered. Mrs. Judd, who had polished the same hall for 20 years, took down the portrait of the hunting party and found a line of dust where the frame had hung. She felt a guilt that did not belong to her and replaced the picture without speaking. What changed was not a single career or a single marriage. It was the national habit of thought. The aristocracy had claimed to be the guardians of a morality that kept the lamps of the empire burning. When the doors opened and the rooms were counted, it became clear that the lamps had been shaded on purpose. The empire did not falter in its armies or its tariffs. Ships still left the docks. Trains still shook the night with their iron certainty. But the quiet faculty by which people believe the best of those who rule them was damaged. Belief does not repair itself like plaster. It repairs itself like bone, and it heals slowly. And sometimes it sets in a different shape. There were those who laughed. Caricatures filled shop windows with grotesque masks and elaborate curtains. Laughter can be an instrument for justice, but it also forgets the cost paid by the small. A maid dismissed without a reference because a letter had been seen. A seamstress asked in a whisper for details she did not have. A coachman told to wait outside a side door that would never open again. The scandal became their work. They ate it with their bread. Lady Evelyn Ashburn kept a room where a diary waited with its ribbon uncut. After the news, she lit no lamps. In that room, she sat by the window and looked at the sky that London allows between roofs. She remembered the stubborn respectability of mornings. She remembered the gardener who hummed as he cut roses and the smell that rose from the basket. She thought of her husband speaking in the house about the duty of restraint. She placed her hand on the closed book and felt the tooth of the paper through the cover. She could not decide whether truth belonged to the page or to silence. The decision stayed with her through the seasons. Thomas Bell stood on a bridge at dusk and watched a raft of leaves twist in the current. He had driven carriages for men whose faces were now printed in a shade of ink. That indicated scandal without saying so. He did not cheer. He did not curse. He tried to think whether a lord bled any different from a dock worker. He decided that the answer did not matter. The river took both without a change in its sound. Parliament met and used many words to say very little. Committees were formed to consider the condition of public morals, as if morality could be improved by minutes and reports. Preachers thundered against sin and then sighed in vestries, where the candles smelled of tallow and the draught would not be kept out. The middle class took a long look at the mirror and approved what they saw. Bankers and merchants felt themselves justified. They had always believed that marriage should sit above birth. The scandal was a ladder they had not expected and were quick to climb. This is the result that lingered after the doors were shut and the posters were taken down. The rooms did not vanish. They remained in the imagination of the city, which is a place as real as stone. They remained in the language. A certain shade of lamp became a joke. A certain arrangement of mirrors became a warning. Children who grew into the next century learned to smile. When someone spoke too loudly about purity, painters placed a red curtain in the background, and the viewer felt complicit without knowing why. There is a moment in every story when an object begins to mean more than itself. The velvet curtain was cloth, and yet it was also a promise that the world outside could be held at bay. The mirror was glass, and yet it multiplied the self until the self could not be found. The mask was satin, and yet it allowed a face to rest from its duty when the outcome finally entered print. These objects slipped from private hands into public memory. They became emblems. They asked a question that was larger than a single name. What kind of society demands a perfect surface, and then is shocked to discover the rooms it has forced into shadow? In the end, the houses still stand. The rain still burns a faint smell from the stone. The railings still keep their black. If you pass at evening and the light is kind, you can almost see the red glow that once lived behind a drape and feel the breath of those who learned to whisper before they learned to speak. The scandal grew old and turned into history. The outcome remains. It is a scene that runs through the century. It reminds the city that whenever a people praise a virtue they do not practice, the praise becomes a hammer that will one day strike the praise itself. The public only saw the revelations when the century drew toward its close, but the seeds had been planted decades earlier. The hidden salons and velvet-draped chambers were not sudden inventions. They were the natural outgrowth of pressures that bore down on Victorian society. To understand how those rooms came to exist, one must trace the causes that lay close at hand: wealth, repression, servants, the press, and the peculiar condition of women within the bonds of marriage. London in the 1860s and 1870s was a city swollen with wealth from empire. Ships unloaded tea and cotton along the docks, their smells mingling with tar and brine. Aristocratic fortunes rose on sugar and opium, on railways and colonial trade. Their houses filled with objects brought from distant lands, porcelain vases with dragons painted in cobalt, Persian rugs that smelled faintly of dye, silks that shimmered in gaslight. These artifacts were displayed as symbols of empire. Yet in private they became instruments of fantasy. A carved mask from Africa, hung in a drawing room, inspired games where identities slipped. A silk shawl from Kashmir, spread across a sofa, served as a veil between roles. Wealth provided not only privacy, but the props with which imagination could construct its theaters of secrecy. Servants, though invisible in society's eyes, played a decisive role. They polished banisters until their reflections looked back at them, carried letters still warm with wax, and arranged carriages at ungodly hours. Many were trusted to guard the very doors that hid their master's indulgence. A maid would usher in a veiled visitor with lowered eyes. A butler would cough discreetly when footsteps approached. Yet dependence on such silence was precarious. A dismissed valet might take with him not only hunger, but memory. A chambermaid, insulted once too often, could repeat what she had heard behind closed doors. Secrets, though wrapped in velvet, rested in the hands of those least valued. Another cause lay in the laws themselves. Parliament, eager to appear as the guardian of morality, passed the Obscene Publications Act in 1857, criminalizing indecent literature. Brothels were raided, theaters censored, novels suppressed. The language of purity filled pulpits and papers. Yet every prohibition sharpened curiosity. What was banned gained allure. And for those with titles and means, transgression became irresistible precisely because it was forbidden. They built chambers not only to indulge desire, but to heighten it. Savoring the thrill of breaking rules they themselves had helped to create. The press, too, fed the fire it later exposed. Fleet Street had discovered that scandal sold, steam-powered. Presses breathed like furnaces through the night, spitting out thousands of sheets that smelled of ink and oil. Journalists, hungry for readers, prowled the streets for stories. A servant's whisper, a courtesan's grievance, even a discarded letter could be transformed into a headline. As papers sharpened their appetite for exposure, the aristocracy felt the walls close in. Privacy became a fortress, guarded by codes, masks, and rooms designed to conceal. Yet the very effort to hide created patterns that made discovery more tantalizing. The condition of women within marriage played its own part. Aristocratic ladies lived in cassettes that pinched their breath and schedules that allowed little more than visits, sewing, and silence. Their husbands governed estates, sat in parliament, or disappeared into clubs. For women, the hidden chamber became less a stage of vice than a refuge. Diaries record the relief of casting off stays, of speaking without fear, of exploring affections. Forbidden in public. To call these gatherings merely perverse is to miss their complexity. They were acts of rebellion against a society that reduced women to ornaments. Desire mingled with defiance. Intellectual currents added another layer. The age of Darwin and anthropology encouraged fascination with primitive customs. Gentlemen attended lectures on evolution and returned home speaking of rituals in far-off lands. Some of these ideas, distorted and romanticized, filtered into their entertainments. Masks, chants, and staged tableaux borrowed the language of scholarship, but served the ends of fantasy. The border between science and indulgence blurred, and the line between curiosity and hypocrisy vanished altogether. Thus, the immediate causes of the hidden chambers were not simple lusts, but an intricate web. Wealth supplied the means. Servants provided both protection and peril. Laws forbidding desire created the thrill of transgression. The press sharpened the fear of exposure. Women, caged by propriety, sought freedom in secrecy. Intellectual fashions lent justification to indulgence. Together these forces converged, pressing the aristocracy to live double lives, rigid in public, elaborate in private. By the time the scandals broke in the 1890s, the causes had been at work for half a century. The velvet rooms were not aberrations. They were symptoms of an age that demanded silence while whispering constantly of virtue. Every sermon, every law, every editorial against indecency pushed the powerful further into secrecy. The chambers of pleasure were built less of stone and fabric than of repression itself. Fog lay along the embankment like a quilt of grey wool. The lamps along the river made small golden islands in a sea of mist. Edwin Harrow moved through that hush with his collar up and his hat brim wet. He carried a folder under his arm, It held pages that had passed from one uneasy hand to another, like a confession that wished to be spoken yet feared the sound of its own voice. He had met a clerk that afternoon in a tea room off Chancery Lane. The man smelled of iron gall ink and cheap soap. He did not give his name. He spoke in a whisper that trembled, then laid the papers down as if he were placing a sick child on a bed. Edwin waited until the door closed before he began to read. The first letter was a small masterpiece of self-betrayal. It used the language of flowers to describe meetings that were not about gardens. A lily meant the rented house near Russell Square. A violet meant a companion not named in public life. The writer was a man of rank. His signature was a star drawn in blue. The clerk had noticed the star on more than one document. He had guessed the hand before he dared to admit it. Edwin felt the pulse in his own throat when he reached the last line. The sentence held the promise of payment and the demand for secrecy. He could hear in the vowels the voice of a man who had lectured Parliament. On the virtue of restraint, the second document sat heavier on the page. It was an inventory made by a solicitor during a dispute with a creditor. It listed objects from a house facing the park, mirrors that could be tilted, lamps shaded in crimson silk, silk masks folded inside a mahogany case, a screen painted with a shepherdess who would not have recognized herself. The inventory had been copied by a clerk who liked neat columns. He had no wish to be a reformer. He simply admired the pencil lines that made order out of goods. Yet, even his careful hand could not remove the sense of a room with a purpose. That did not match the library on the floor below. The third set of pages was a diary. The leather had cracked at the hinge. A ribbon stained with perfume marked the middle. The writing belonged to Lady Margaret Doncaster. She had not intended a reader beyond the self she spoke to in the dark. The diary described a chamber in Kensington, curtains of dense velvet, a rug from Persia, a lamp fitted with a shade the color of wine. The room was a sanctuary for women who felt that their days were spent posing as themselves. They came without chaperones. They removed cassettes and the roles that cassettes supported. They tried on other names and other affections. The writing did not gloat. It trembled between relief and fear. Edwin read the line that said simply, "I felt alive for an hour." He put the page aside and stared at the window where fog pressed against glass like a visitor who refused to leave. A sketch followed. It had been made by an artist who never received the final payment for a commission. He had been hired to paint decorations in a private room. When he was dismissed with promises that went no further than words, he used memory as his patron. The sketch showed the arrangement of lamps and mirrors. It showed a screen with a shepherdess, a sofa deep enough to swallow discretion, and a mask with a long nose that looked absurd until one imagined it hiding a familiar face. Edwin felt a chill that had nothing to do with the fog. He left the tea room and carried the folder to the printers on Fleet Street. The building throbbed with the rhythm of the press. Hot metal, oil, wet paper, and heat made a smell that felt like a living thing. Printers spoke in short phrases because the machines were loud. Edwin stood with the foreman and marked the lines that could be printed and the lines that had to. remain in his pocket. The foreman looked at him with a pity that was close to respect. He had seen these choices before. He had watched laws turn into a fence that honest men learned to walk along without falling. The first edition placed the letters in paraphrase. It named no one. It made clear that certain references were not innocent. The city responded like a body that has been struck in the same place too many times. There was shock, then talk, then a deep quiet that lasted until the afternoon when talk returned with names attached. People enjoy the exercise of guessing. A judge was overheard in his club saying that gossip had always been the poor man's parliament. A merchant said that the poor did not own gossip any more than they owned coal or bread. The laughter that followed felt tense. Everyone knew that something had shifted a degree closer to the point where denial becomes farce. At a dinner in Belgravia, a lady unfolded a paper fan and asked whether anyone had seen the drawings that were not prints. A gentleman said he had not, and his eyes moved away from hers. A preacher in Bloomsbury thundered about the wrath of God, and his congregation flinched less at the message than at the possibility that their own names could be caught in the storm of words. In a tavern by the docks, a man with rough hands said to his friend, "They are only people." The friend answered, "Yes, but they told us they were more than people." That was the bruise. The turning point was not a single article. It was the accumulation of evidence that would not lie down. A maid came forward with a parcel of letters she had been told to burn. She had been dismissed without wages. She had a mother with a bad chest and a brother without shoes. She gave the letters to a junior reporter who felt his career begin at the feel of the ribbon that bound them. A coachman admitted that he had waited outside a house on a night when no dinner parties were held. He had watched the curtains close at an hour when respectable people still stood at their windows. A valet, drunk on a payday he could not afford, spoke of masks stored in a case and of a gentleman whose laughter did not match the sermon he had preached that morning in the Lord's. When Edwin wrote his copy, he kept his sentences clean. He avoided adjectives that would soil the page. He let the facts speak. The editor asked, "Can we prove the hand on the letters?" Edwin said, "We can show the star in blue at the bottom of the page. We can show the same star on a note from the Viscount." To a banker, the editor nodded. He drew his pencil through a line that named the street and another that named a servant. He left in the detail about the velvet shade on a lamp. He had learned that the smallest detail could be the largest proof. A shade is only cloth. Yet when a reader sees the color of wine written in a diary, the reader believes the room. Lady Margaret left London for her sister in the country. Her piano was closed. The house smelled of linen that had not been aired. The Viscount claimed illness and retreated behind a physician who had mastered the art of saying nothing. The artist who had drawn his memory accepted a few coins from a printer and spent them quickly. He had not expected to move history. He wished only to be paid for work honestly done. In the kitchens of grand houses, servants spoke half sentences that ended in silence. That silence was a kind of testimony. It said that people who wash the cups and fold the linen could topple a story by what they chose. Not to say the impact reached Parliament. Questions were asked in a tone that pretended to be calm. Could the laws of morality be guided by men whose evenings did not resemble their mornings? A member stood and said that there was nothing to the stories. Then he sat down and wiped his brow in a way that made his denial look like a fever. In the churches, sermons grew more strident. In the streets, songs were invented that mocked masks and mirrors. The songs were vulgar and clever. Children sang them without knowing what they meant. That was the measure of the change. When songs enter the street, a scandal becomes a season. Edwin walked again to the river when the second edition was done. He leaned on the stone and watched frost form along the balustrade. He wondered whether he had done good or harm. He thought of Lady Margaret's line about an hour of life. He thought of the maid who had carried letters and of the star drawn in blue ink. He considered the strange justice of a world where those who made laws about purity gave to history the very papers that proved their failure. The fog lifted for a moment and revealed the water beneath, black and glossy, carrying broken reflections away. The turning point did not end with unrest or a resignation. It ended with a change in the city's manner of seeing. People began to look at the faces in carriages as if those faces wore masks even in daylight. People began to read speeches as if there were a second text beneath the words. The rooms with velvet curtains had entered the common mind. They had become a symbol that outlived their owners. This was the moment when secrecy lost its monopoly. What had been carefully hidden had learned to travel by rumor, by print, by picture, and by the private arithmetic of the heart that adds one detail to another until belief tips and will not return to its former balance. The scandal moved outward. From the salons of Mayfair, the way ripples moved from a stone thrown into still water. At first, the circles were small anxious whispers in drawing rooms, veiled remarks in Parliament, sharp sentences in the columns of Fleet Street. But soon, the circles touched every part of society, from the poorest alleys of Whitechapel to the halls of empire abroad. What began as rumor became atmosphere. One could breathe it in London's winter air, heavy with coal smoke, carrying not only soot, but also suspicion. In the taverns of the East End, dock workers leaned against wooden counters sticky with ale, a man with shoulders broadened by ropes, and barrels lifted a newspaper with fingers cracked from cold. "So this is virtue," he said, and the others laughed, not kindly, but with the grim satisfaction of men long scolded for sins they had never denied. For them, the hypocrisy of the nobility was confirmation. They had been told their drunkenness was moral failure, their poverty a sign of weakness. Now they saw that those who condemned them lived with indulgences far costlier than a pint. The scandal became their weapon, a rougher quality delivered by the press. In Belgravia's parlors, the mood was different. Fear and fascination intermingled. Ladies with white gloves pressed fans to their faces, lowering their voices to discuss the velvet chamber or the Viscount's coded lilies. A flutter of scandal gave them a thrill they could never admit in daylight. Yet each knew the peril. A diary found, a letter mislaid, a servant indiscreet, and their names might find their way into print. Behind the glitter of chandeliers stretched an unease like the tremor before a storm. Even those untouched by rumor felt exposed. Propriety became performance more anxious than ever. The press swelled on the feast. Steam presses pounded like iron drums, their heat filling the air with the smell of oil and metal. Printers shouted to one another over the roar. Each morning boys ran through the streets with headlines that promised revelations and delivered hints. The lack of names sharpened appetite rather than dulled it. Readers supplied the missing words themselves. Caricatures filled shop windows. Grotesque sketches of lords in masks and ladies in velvet. Crowds gathered to laugh, their mirth edged with contempt. In this laughter lay a subtle transfer of power. The mighty had become entertainment. Reformers seized the moment. Preachers thundered that God had stripped the veil from false virtue. Pamphleteers distributed tracts that declared hereditary privilege bankrupt. Not in money alone, but in morality. In Manchester, industrialists cited the scandals as proof that true progress lay with merit, not birth. In Glasgow, Labour leaders pointed to them as evidence that the ruling class was unfit to dictate discipline to the working man. In Dublin, nationalist voices mocked Britain's pretensions of moral superiority. The scandal, in revealing hypocrisy, became fuel for movements already stirring against the old order. Abroad, too, the tremors were felt. In Calcutta, an Indian journalist wrote that Britain scolded local customs while its own lords danced in masks. In Cape Town, missionaries struggled to defend the image of a moral empire when letters from home spoke of velvet chambers. The empire's claim to guide others by virtue sounded hollower in the face of such contradictions. Moral authority, once a silent foundation of dominion, began to erode at the edges. Within the aristocracy, divisions widened. Some families withdrew, drawing blinds, cancelling balls, retreating to country estates, where deer roamed and gossip traveled slower. Others confronted scandal with ostentatious defiance, attending every event, glittering in jewels, smiling as though daring the papers to print their names. Yet even these gestures carried desperation. At dinners, conversation faltered. Behind polite greetings lay suspicion. Who had spoken? Who had written? Who had betrayed? Masks became metaphors not only for private games, but for public life itself. Ordinary Londoners consumed these tales with a hunger that was both moral and voyeuristic. They read about crimson lumps and mirrored walls with condemnation on their lips and curiosity in their eyes. The scandal became common property, discussed in kitchens as much as in clubs. It blurred class lines by uniting everyone in judgment of those above. But it also revealed the impossibility of a society that demanded perfection in public and secrecy in private. If the aristocracy could not embody its own laws, what hope for the rest? One evening Edwin Harrow stood beneath the lamps of Fleet Street and listened to the cry of newsboys. Velvet chamber exposed. The words rang against the stone facades, echoed in the damp air. He watched men in overcoats stop to buy a sheet, watched women glance furtively as they passed, watched a beggar pick a discarded copy from the gutter. The scandal had become not only a story, but a currency, traded by rich and poor alike. Edwin thought of the paradox. Truth had emerged, yet what people desired most were the shadows around it. The very vagueness kept the city alive with imagination. Thus, the reverberations of the hidden salons were not contained. They rolled outward, shaking not only reputations, but the moral confidence of a nation. The empire marched on, but the foundation had shifted. Respect no longer came unchallenged. Every sermon, every law, every speech from the lords now carried an echo. Velvet curtains, crimson lamps, masks folded in mahogany cases. The scandal had given society new eyes, and once opened, those eyes would not close again. The scandal of the velvet chambers lingered like a faint perfume long after the lamps were extinguished and the curtains drawn away. It is tempting to think of such revelations as belonging only to their own time. The curiosity of one generation that vanishes when another takes its place. Yet the deeper truth of those hidden rooms is that they forced society to confront the contradictions upon which it had been built. They revealed the fault line between what was spoken in daylight and what was lived in the shadows. That fault line has not closed. London, in the years after the exposures, wore its unease like a second coat. The carriages still clattered along the Strand. The river still rolled beneath its fog, and Parliament still thundered with speeches on virtue. But behind every proclamation lay suspicion. People listened with an ear sharpened by cynicism. A statesman who praised chastity seemed at once a man with a secret. A lady who lectured on purity carried with her the imagined weight of a diary hidden in a drawer. Trust, once unthinking, became fragile. The empire's strength was not visibly weakened, but its moral sheen had dulled, and no polish could restore it fully. For the aristocracy themselves, the revelations carried lessons too bitter to be forgotten. Families withdrew into silence. Dinners were held with fewer guests. Some fled abroad, seeking to outlast gossip in the anonymity of foreign cities. Others clung stubbornly to appearances, attending every ball, glittering with defiance. But beneath both retreat and defiance lay the same recognition. The mask had been torn, and it would never again fit as tightly. They had been reminded that wealth could buy silence for a season, but never for eternity. For ordinary people, the scandal was both entertainment and education. A seamstress in Soho, reading second-hand papers by candlelight, saw proof that her own small failings did not set her apart from her betters. A dock worker on the Thames, listening to tavern gossip, found grim satisfaction that hypocrisy had been unmasked. The revelation did not erase hardship, but it shifted perspective. It taught that those who judged most harshly were themselves vulnerable. That knowledge was a kind of quiet liberation. The women whose diaries and letters were exposed deserve particular reflection. History often remembers them only as figures of scandal, yet in truth they embodied both the suffering and rebellion of their age. Bound by cassettes and conventions, they carved secret spaces where they could breathe, laugh, and explore affections denied in public. Their rooms were not only stages of desire, but sanctuaries of freedom. In their pages we hear not the boast of indulgence, but the sigh of relief. I felt alive for an hour. That line speaks across centuries, reminding us that human beings cannot be reduced to roles imposed by society. Looking from our own vantage point, the pattern feels hauntingly familiar. Today's leaders too are measured by the gap between words and deeds. Technology has changed, but exposure remains. The press of Fleet Street has given way to the endless current of digital screens. Yet the hunger for revelation is the same. A diary once hidden in a drawer is now a message preserved in a cloud. A sketch once smuggled to a printer is now a photograph shared in moments. Hypocrisy remains fragile and secrecy remains temporary. The legacy of the Victorian salons is thus not confined to their crimson lamps and velvet curtains. Their true legacy lies in the reminder that repression breeds duplicity. When a society demands silence about desire, it forces that desire into shadows where it grows theatrical, elaborate, and dangerous when those who impose such silence are revealed to indulge in what they forbid. The betrayal strikes deeper than the act itself. It erodes the bond of trust upon which authority rests. So we reflect, more than a century later, not with mockery but with recognition. The aristocracy of Victorian Britain were human, flawed, and fearful. They were trapped as much by their own laws as by their own appetites. Their hidden chambers teach us that no wealth, no rank, no power can conceal contradiction forever. Truth waits, patient as time, and when the curtains part, it enters with a light that blinds and liberates alike. If you are still awake, press 1 in the comments. London had already learned the taste of scandal. Yet the city discovered a new bitterness when the diaries of certain women came to light. It was one thing to hear that lords lived a double life. It was another to read a duchess describe in her own steady hand the small world she built behind curtains that drank the noise of the street. In the early 1890s, those pages began to pass from a solicitor's drawer to a clerk's pocket, and at last into the rooms of editors, where the air smelled of hot metal and ink. The paper was brittle, the perfume old and faint, and the words moved. With a calm that seemed braver than defiance, they did not circle their subject. They walked toward it with a measured step. The outcome must be told before the cusses. The discovery broke the last defense of a national myth. For years society managed the idea that men wandered and that wives forgave. Sermons scolded, Parliament thundered, and the world continued to dress itself in respectability. That arrangement relied on a belief that women kept a reservoir of virtue into which men might return washed and penitent. The diaries changed the equation. If the guardians of home sought their own hours of escape, then the altar of domestic purity stood on sand. What toppled in those pages was not a single household, but an ideal that had steadied a restless age. Lady Margaret Doncaster's journal became the emblem of this form. The book wore blue leather and the faint memory of lavender. In it she described a chamber in Kensington that she called the Velvet Room. She wrote of curtains that swallowed sound until the room seemed to breathe on its own. She wrote of a rug from Persia that held warmth even in winter, and a screen painted with pastoral scenes that had never known a field. She wrote of lamps shaded in crimson that gave the air the color of wine. Lace and chains stood together on a small table, not as quarreling ideas, but as companions. Lace softened the eye with grace. Chains gave direction to the play of wills. Neither was named with bravado. Both were recorded with the same careful plainness she used to set down the weather. When a solicitor read a few passages aloud during a dispute over a trust, the room held its breath. Clerks who had counted estates now heard the voice of a woman, claiming a private life. The clock on the mantel ticked as if it wished to speak. News of the reading moved through the city with the quiet speed of a tide. A copyist took a handful of pages to Fleet Street and received a coin he had not expected to see. Editors argued not over truth, but over risk and libel. Printers waited at the cases while decisions arrived, their fingers black with ink, their coats smelling of oil and paper dust. By evening, the first cautious hints were set in type, and the stones of the press began to tremble. The public read what the papers dared to print and supplied what the papers left unsaid. In the markets of the East End, the air smelled of fish and damp straw. Women leaned over baskets and told one another that even fine ladies had hearts that beat in their ribs and not only in their portraits. In clubs along Pall Mall, gentlemen practiced indifference and asked for more brandy. While glancing at the headlines they claimed not to believe, a judge declared that rumor was the tax paid by rank. A widow in Wapping, warming her hands above a stove, said softly that secrets grew in rich soil as easily as in poor ground. Husbands became a study in faces. Some took refuge in thunder. Others spoke in balanced phrases that could not hide their fear. A few looked at their wives as if meeting them for the first time. They had believed that women kept a well of purity while men drew from it, and returned to be forgiven. The open book on the table said that the well had its own current. It said that forgiveness could not be the only work of marriage. In certain houses, voices were raised. In others, nothing was said at all, and the silence spread through the rooms like a smell of extinguished candles. The churches answered in the language they knew. Pulpits named ancient sins and modern temptations. Candles smoked. A choir sang a hymn that could not quite find its key. Some women sat with hands folded and eyes lowered. Others looked straight at the preacher and did not blink. When the bells dismissed the congregation, the street gave back the sound of hooves and the hiss of gas lamps. The stone was wet. The air smelled of horse sweat and rain. People walked home with music still in their ears. And a question the sermon had not touched dotted his window. Edwin Harrow copied lines by lamplight and felt a weight that was not triumph. He had exposed men and found that truth tasted of iron. Reading Lady Margaret, he tasted salt. He thought of his mother, who kept a small notebook of grocery sums and hymn numbers. That plain book had never been used, yet it held a quiet dignity. Lady Margaret's book had become a weapon in a battle she had, not meant to fight. Between the two lay a map of a society that demanded a performance from everyone and gave compassion to almost no one. Edwin closed his eyes and saw the velvet room as she had drawn it in words. Bright with a crimson shade, softened by a rug, emptied now of its voices, yet filled with an after-sound like the last note of a piano. The result that history must record is not only disgrace, it is revelation. The diaries showed that the theater of secrecy did not belong to men alone. Women built rooms where the day's commands could be set aside, and where a body belonged to the person who lived inside it. They tried on roles as A woman tries dresses, not to deceive, but to find which one allowed her to breathe. They wrote about tenderness with a gravity that made the page feel warm. They wrote about fear with an honesty that cooled the blood. They wrote about longing in sentences that did not plead and did not boast. Their candor did not destroy the idea of the home. It revealed that the home had always contained more life than its portraits allowed. Objects once admired only for display took on new meanings when listed in print. A corset loosened at night ceased to be an emblem of elegance and became a tool of release. A ribbon no longer tied hair, but held a wrist with consent. Spoken quietly and clearly, a mirror did not flatter, but multiplied a single woman until she could study the faces she had been given to wear. A bottle of perfume turned a room into a memory even after those within it had gone. Each object answered a simple claim. The private life of women was not a blank, and it was not a sermon. It was a landscape with its own weather, its own tides, and its own borders kept safe by silence until the day silence broke. What did the empire lose when it learned these truths? It lost the innocence that let it wear power like a halo. Authority still commanded, but it could no longer pretend to be beyond appeal. Measured by armies and tariffs, the change looked small. Measured by trust, it was large. People began to weigh moral claims rather than bow to them. They began to imagine that the house of a lord and the house of a seamstress both contained promises and faults that no headline could weigh for them. So the result is a change in the weather of belief. The legal record captured names. The newspapers captured gossip. The diaries captured a human fact that refuses to grow old. A society that demands perfection from women builds a wall against which women must lean, until the stone remembers their shape. When the wall is marked with that shape, the city pretends to be shocked. It is not shock, it is recognition. It is the acceptance that angels are made of flesh and that flesh seeks breath, as surely as it seeks bread. Lady Margaret's final entry before the journal was taken says little. She writes that the lamp burned low and that the air smelled of roses left too long in water. She writes that she listened to the street and heard the slow clop of a single horse in the rain. She writes that she felt no shame and also no victory. She places the book in a drawer and ties the ribbon with square knots. The room grows dark. The city turns the page. The scandal that burst from the diaries seemed sudden to the public. But to those who looked closely, the causes had been ripening for half a century. The women who wrote in lavender ink and kept their books under ribbons of silk were not inventing rebellion out of thin air. They were answering forces that pressed against them every hour of every day. To understand the velvet rooms and the words that filled them, one must follow these immediate causes: repression, fashion, servants, law, the press, and the loneliness of marriage that shaped the secret lives of women in the closing years of the century. The first and most obvious cause was repression. No society of modern times wrote so much about virtue as Victorian Britain. Sermons echoed each Sunday in churches heavy with incense, their walls darkened by gaslight and smoke. Schoolrooms taught girls that modesty was their crown, their fortune, their only reliable dowry. A girl of 12 copied maxims about purity into copybooks that smelled of ink and chalk dust, while her body, restless with youth, longed to move more freely than the corset allowed. By 18, she was displayed in parlors where men twice her age measured her worth by her silence and her dowry. By 20, she was married and praised as the angel of the house. The title was gilded, but it weighed like iron. To be angel meant to surrender every trace of being human. That dissonance pressed women to seek corners where they could be mortal. The diary and the hidden chamber became sanctuaries in which breath was not a sin. Another cause was the very fashion that society celebrated. Lace-trimmed gowns rustled in ballrooms lit by 100 chandeliers. Corsets pinched ribs until breath came shallow. Shoes with pearl buttons pinched toes as women stood smiling beside their husbands. These garments, displayed as ornaments of gentility, taught submission by design. Yet fashion also carried within it the seeds of rebellion. The women of the velvet rooms transformed lace and ribbon into tools of their own invention. A corset loosened at night became a declaration of freedom. A ribbon no longer tied hair, but circled wrists with consent whispered and understood. Lace, once meant to cover, could reveal. Chains, delicate and deliberate, did not arrive from foreign markets. They were crafted by the very society that demanded obedience. To turn these objects against their intended script was an act of subtle defiance. Servants formed another immediate cause. No great house functioned without them. They polished banisters until the wood shone. They carried coals that left dust. On their hands, they answered doors at midnight when guests arrived veiled. They knew more than any lord admitted. A maid saw the red lamp lit in a room where no guests were received. A coachman waited in the cold outside a Kensington house until dawn, hearing laughter spill faintly through velvet curtains. A valet folded a gown with lace torn in ways no dance could explain. Silence was expected, but silence is never certain. Some servants whispered in kitchens where the air smelled of onions and boiled beef. Others carried their memories to new places of employment, and a few, dismissed without references, brought their stories to Fleet Street. The secrecy of aristocratic women rested precariously on the loyalty of those least valued. The law itself fostered these hidden lives. Parliament in 1857 passed the Obscene Publications Act, banning indecent books and pictures. Police raided brothels and closed theaters that dared too much. Yet the home remained untouched, shielded as sacred. Husbands owned property, wages, and reputations. Wives were expected to submit without complaint. Divorce was rare, scandalous, and ruinous to a woman's name. In this silence, the home became both prison and stage. The paradox was cruel. The most regulated society in Europe left its most intimate relations unexamined. Inside this blind spot, secrecy thrived. The press sharpened the paradox. Fleet Street discovered that scandal was gold. Steam presses throbbed like furnaces through the night, spitting thousands of sheets that smelled of hot metal and oil. Reporters learned to listen at taverns, to bribe coachmen, to buy letters never meant for public eyes. A half hint in print was worth more than fact in court. The public devoured suggestions of crimson lamps and mirrored walls. This hunger gave thrill to secrecy itself. Women who wrote their diaries with trembling hands knew the risk. In a strange way, the possibility that their words might one day be read gave them courage to write more boldly. Fear and temptation became twins. Another immediate cause lay in the condition of women within marriage. Husbands, free to disappear into clubs thick with smoke and brandy, expected their wives to preside in drawing rooms like statues carved of flesh. Many marriages were not cruel, but indifferent. Loneliness settled into evenings where clocks ticked loudly against silence. It was in these hours that women created hidden chambers or wrote words, meant for no one but themselves. A countess confessed in her diary that she did not long for ecstasy alone, but for laughter, for the warmth of conversation, for the chance to be seen as more than an ornament beside her husband's title. The velvet rooms, far from being dens of vice, were refuges against neglect. Intellectual fashions also contributed. The age of Darwin and anthropology had awakened curiosity about ritual and sexuality in other cultures. Lectures at the Royal Institution described dances of Pacific Islands, ceremonies of Africa, rites of fertility. Gentlemen carried these tales home, distorted and romanticized. Women, hearing fragments, wove them into their own fantasies. Masks, chants, and borrowed rituals entered the private chambers of Kensington and Mayfair. Science lent cover to desire, and scholarship blurred into indulgence. Taken together, these causes reveal that this scandal was less about sudden corruption than about long suppression. Women were trapped between sermons that denied their bodies and fashions that shackled them, between laws that erased their voices and husbands who ignored their loneliness. Servants watched, newspapers whispered, and intellectual fashions provided a strange vocabulary for rebellion. Out of these strands, the diaries were woven. Thus, the immediate causes of the velvet rooms were not extraordinary. They were the ordinary conditions of Victorian life, intensified by wealth and silence. The city pretended to be shocked when the words appeared in print, but in truth it had written those words itself, line by line, in every corset fastened, every sermon preached, every law left unchanged. By the early 1890s, the stories of women's secret diaries and velvet-draped chambers had become more than rumor. They formed a weight the city could no longer balance. What had begun as whispers in drawing rooms and footnotes in solicitors' disputes reached a moment of exposure so sharp that even the Parliament, so often deaf to scandal, could not pretend silence. This was the turning point when private words crossed the fragile border into public truth. It began with a maid dismissed without wages. Her mistress, a baroness known for her serene portraits, had kept a diary bound in green leather. Within its pages were lines too plain to be mistaken. The maid carried the book to Fleet Street in a paper parcel, its corners damp from the fog. A junior reporter bought it with coins that smelled of copper and hunger. That night he sat in a room above a tavern, his candle guttering, and read words that burned more brightly than flame. They spoke not of great scandals, but of small defiance, of cassettes unfastened with a sigh, of laughter shared in whispers, of an hour of tenderness claimed against a world of silence. The plainness made the truth undeniable. Editors argued long. Into the morning, could they print? Would the law strike? They trimmed names, removed places, and left details that glowed with suggestion. When the presses roared to life, the air filled with the sharp smell of ink and hot oil. Boys ran into the streets at dawn. Their voices breaking the city's slumber. A lady's diary revealed. People bought papers with hands still stiff from sleep. Within hours, gossip became history. The impact was immediate. In parlors across Belgravia, women pretended not to have seen the news, then asked casually for another cup of tea while eyes flickered to the folded paper on the table. Men in clubs swore loudly that it was lies, yet kept the sheets folded in their pockets. In taverns, dockworkers laughed with bitterness, saying, "So much for angels of the house." Even children sang snatches of rhymes invented from headlines, their voices carrying scandal into alleys that smelled of coal dust. And Cabbage. Lady Margaret's diary, already whispered about, now stood as emblem. Artists sketched crude caricatures of the velvet room, crimson lamps, mirrored walls, lace draped over chairs. Shop windows displayed these drawings beside penny novels. Crowds gathered to laugh, but beneath the laughter was unease. The figure of the virtuous lady, once untouchable, now seemed fragile as glass. Every portrait in the National Gallery seemed to whisper a question. What did she write? When the candles were extinguished, Parliament, too, could not escape. A member rose to denounce the press for indecency, his voice shaking more than the words required. Another asked, half in jest, whether gentlemen who legislated on women's virtue might submit their own wives' diaries for inspection. Laughter filled the chamber, thin and cutting. The turning point lay not in the law, but in the mood. Authority had lost its immunity. In the churches, sermons grew louder. Preachers thundered that God had stripped the veil from sin. Yet even as voices rose, congregations shifted uneasily. Women listened with faces calm, but some carried within them the knowledge that sermons condemned their longings as well as their courage. Men listened with ears sharpened by fear. Any wife might have a diary. Every household might harbor a velvet room. The press pressed further. Reporters bribed servants, questioned shopkeepers, hunted for letters never burned. A dressmaker confessed she had sewn gowns with hidden fastenings for clients who wished to move more freely. A bookseller admitted he had sold volumes of poetry. Buy sofa wrapped in plain paper to ladies with veils. Each fragment fed the fire. The city discovered that the scandal was not one room but many, not one diary but dozens, not one lady but a class. The turning point was not a single revelation, but the avalanche of detail. A society can deny one rumor, but it cannot deny 100 voices speaking in different keys. The diaries, once meant to hold solitude, became a chorus. That chorus sang not with triumph, but with necessity. It said, "We are human. We are more than the roles you have written for us." Edwin Harrow, who had once exposed the velvet chambers of men, now found himself custodian of women's words. He sat by the river, the fog thick as wool, and wondered whether history would call him cruel or faithful. He felt no joy in scandal. He felt only the weight of truth. He remembered the line written by Lady Margaret, "I felt alive for an hour." It rang in his mind like a bell tolling over the city. That line was the turning point. It transformed scandal into testimony. From that hour forward, London could not return to its old illusions. Women were no longer merely angels. They were witnesses, writers, rebels. The diaries had shifted the ground. The city stood uneasy, but it stood in a new age where silence no longer seemed eternal. The scandal of the diaries did not stay confined to the houses of Belgravia or the clubs of Pall Mall. Once the words had slipped into print, they belonged to the city itself, and the city carried them like a fever in the blood. The reverberations moved outward in widening rings, touching parlors, markets, factories, and even the distant territories of empire. What began as private confession became public atmosphere, and that atmosphere pressed upon every class dot in the East End taverns. Dock workers leaned over counters sticky with ale. A man with hands thickened by ropes lifted a cheap newspaper and read aloud in halting syllables. The print told of ladies who unfastened cassettes in rooms shaded crimson. The men laughed, but the laughter carried bitterness. "So these are they, angels that scolded us," one said. His companions nodded, their mugs knocking the wood with dull thuds. For the poor, the scandal confirmed what they had long suspected. That virtue was demanded of them while indulgence was reserved for the wealthy. Hypocrisy became visible, and with visibility came a strange equality. In Belgravia parlors, the mood was sharper. Ladies in silken gowns raised fans to their faces, whispering behind painted feathers. They discussed the scandal with voices lowered, but each feared her own secrets might one day appear in type. Husbands read papers by firelight and folded, then with too much care, as though gentleness with the page might erase what it contained. Dinners grew quieter. Guests glanced at portraits on the wall, wondering what truths those serene faces might conceal. The air smelled of beeswax and anxiety. The press fed on the ferment. Fleet Street roared with presses that breathed ink into the fog. Editors discovered that suggestion sold as well as fact. Caricatures of velvet rooms and chained wrists appeared in shop windows. Crowds gathered to laugh at grotesque sketches of lords in masks and ladies in lace, yet beneath the laughter lay unease. When the powerful become entertainment, power itself is diminished. Every fresh edition spread suspicion further, until even the innocent looked guilty by association. Reformers seized the opportunity. Preachers thundered that God had torn the veil from sin. Pamphleteers distributed tracts declaring hereditary privilege corrupt in morality as well as in finance. Industrialists in Manchester argued that progress belonged to merit, not birth. In Glasgow, Labour leaders used the scandal as proof that the ruling class had no right to preach discipline to working men. In Dublin, nationalists mocked Britain's moral pretensions. Abroad, colonial subjects read the stories with grim amusement. An Indian journalist wrote that Britain scolded native customs, while its own aristocrats lived in secret chambers. Missionaries in Africa found their sermons questioned by locals who had read English papers. The empire's moral authority, never secure, eroded further. Within the aristocracy, divisions grew. Some families retreated to country estates, their blinds drawn, their names absent from city lists. Others responded with defiance, appearing at every ball glittering with jewels, smiling as if to challenge the press to name them. Yet both retreat and defiance betrayed the same fear. The mask no longer fit. Trust among the elite frayed. A lady whispered less freely to her companion, fearing betrayal. A lord eyed his valet with suspicion, knowing that silence could be sold. The very intimacy of service became a danger among ordinary Londoners. The scandal was consumed with fascination. Seamstresses read columns by candlelight, their fingers rough with needlework, and whispered that noble women were not so different after all. Dockworkers sang ballads that mocked crimson lamps and velvet curtains. Children in alleyways skipped rope to rhymes that mingled innocence with scandal, carrying the stories into the next generation. The scandal blurred lines of class by uniting rich and poor in judgment of those above them. Yet it also opened a question more troubling. If even the guardians of virtue failed, what standard remained? For women, the reverberations were complex. Some felt betrayed, ashamed that figures of their sex had been exposed. Others felt a stirring of solidarity. In diaries written far from London, women recorded that they no longer felt alone. A school teacher in Brighton confessed to her notebook that she read Lady Margaret's words with trembling hands and felt courage kindle. A farmer's wife in Yorkshire, turning the pages of a borrowed newspaper, whispered to herself that angels were flesh after all. The scandal gave them language, however whispered, to imagine a life beyond silence. Even in Parliament, the reverberations were felt. Questions were raised about the press, about morality, about the example set for the nation. Debates rang beneath the gaslight arches, voices stern yet uneasy. Members who condemned the scandal most fiercely found their words met with smirks. A whisper could undo a career more swiftly than opposition votes. Authority had been weakened, not by war or deficit, but by diaries written in lavender ink. Edwin Harrow walked through Fleet Street at dusk, the smell of hot metal and ink heavy in the air. He watched boys run with bundles of papers, their shouts echoing against stone. He knew that the scandal had become more than story. It was a mirror. In it the city saw both hypocrisy and possibility. He thought again of Lady Margaret's words, "I felt alive for an hour." That sentence, more than any caricature, haunted the public imagination. It whispered that beneath lace and chains lay something universal, the human desire to live as oneself, if only for a fleeting hour. Thus the reverberations spread. They touched taverns and parlors, churches and factories, colonies and councils. They revealed that morality enforced by silence breeds duplicity, and duplicity breeds scandal. When secrecy collapsed, society was left not only with shame, but with recognition. The diaries had unfastened more than cassettes. They had unfastened the myth of virtue itself. The scandal that had begun with a few private diaries ended by reshaping how an entire nation imagined its women. The revelation of lace and chains in velvet rooms was not merely a titillating episode in Victorian gossip. It was a mirror that forced society to confront its own contradictions. Now that the fever of gossip had cooled, what remained was reflection and the recognition that those hidden hours belonged not only to the women who lived them, but to history itself. London in the years after the exposures wore an unease that could not be brushed away with sermons. The carriages still rolled along Pall Mall. The river still steamed beneath its fog. But every speech about virtue carried an echo. A statesman might rise in Parliament to demand purity of the nation. Yet listeners would glance at one another, remembering crimson lamps and lavender ink. Trust had weakened. The great myth that women were the flawless guardians of morality had cracked beyond repair. The scandal had shown that repression did not preserve virtue. It created secrecy, and secrecy, once exposed, left only cynicism in its place. For women, the consequences were double-edged. On one hand, exposure brought shame. Names whispered. In clubs carried ruin into drawing rooms. Husbands withdrew. Daughters married with less fanfare. Reputations dimmed. But on the other hand, the very fact that diaries had spoken allowed women to recognize one another across silence. A governess in Manchester, reading of Lady Margaret, wrote in her own hidden book that she felt less alone. A schoolteacher in Bath confessed to her notebook that she dared to hope for more than embroidery and sermons. Scandal, while cruel, also created community among women who had thought their desires unique. In the countryside, the reverberations were gentler, but no less real. Farmers' wives reading borrowed newspapers over cups of weak tea found themselves pondering what it meant to be called an angel of the house. The words sounded hollow now, like a hymn sung without faith. They wondered if angels might not be permitted to feel hunger, laughter, or longing. The scandal gave them permission, however faint, to question roles once believed eternal. The empire, too, felt the change. Missionaries abroad struggled to defend Britain's moral authority when their letters from home carried headlines about velvet chambers, colonized peoples, long judged for their customs, quietly observed that the rulers who scolded them lived no cleaner than anyone else. Authority lost its aura of sanctity. The empire still commanded ships and armies, but it could not command respect with the same certainty. A diary written in Kensington had weakened the halo of empire in Calcutta, Cape Town, and Dublin alike. The lessons extended further. Repression, it turned out, could not erase human longing. It could only drive it underground, where it grew theatrical, elaborate, and desperate. Lace and chains were not foreign imports. They were the products of a society that demanded silence. The scandal revealed that when one builds a cage of virtue, the bird will sing in secret. And when that song is discovered, the sound is louder. For having been suppressed, modern readers cannot help but see parallels. Today's scandals erupt not in lavender-bound diaries, but in messages preserved on screens. In photographs that circulate with ruthless speed, the tools have changed, but the pattern endures. Leaders preach virtue, yet their private lives betray them. The exposure is swift, the judgment harsh, the trust broken. The lesson of the Velvet Rooms is therefore not merely Victorian. It is timeless. Repression creates duplicity, and duplicity, once revealed, shatters authority. Lady Margaret's words still linger. I felt alive for an hour. It is a line that has outlived the scandal, outlived the empire, outlived the century. It speaks across time because it is simple and true. Beneath lace, beneath chains, beneath titles and portraits, there is the human need to live as oneself, even for an hour. That truth could not be erased by scandal. It could only be illuminated by its dots, so we reflect. The scandal of women in chains. And lace was not the end of virtue, but the end of illusion. It revealed that the angel of the house was not an angel at all, but a woman of flesh, desiring, fearful, hopeful, and alive. To deny that humanity was to deny history itself. The diaries taught a lesson the city resisted, but could not forget. That freedom, even stolen in secret, leaves its mark on the stone of society. If you are still awake, press 1 in the comments. London in the last decade of the 19th century carried scandal like fog over the Thames thick, persistent and inescapable. Yet even a city grown used to whispered tales and printed hints gasped anew when it learned that velvet chambers and lavender diaries were only the beginning. What had seemed private rebellion in quiet rooms now appeared as elaborate performance staged with intention. Entire houses of the aristocracy, once proud of their solemn facades, were discovered to contain hidden theaters where desire itself became drama. Drawing rooms were refitted as stages. Basements were painted with scenes from myth. Even country barns were cleared of hay and transformed into spaces for tableaux lit by torchlight. What had been solitary words in diaries now took form as spectacle, rehearsed and repeated until secrecy became institution. The immediate result of this exposure was astonishment tinged with disbelief. At first, many readers assumed exaggeration. Surely no countess would spend her fortune on painted scenery, nor would a viscount risk reputation by employing musicians to play as torchlight flickered over masquerades. Yet the testimony of servants, delivered in tones of resentment and relief, gave substance. A dismissed valet described the masque of Diana his master hosted. He told of torches burning low, of ivy chains interwoven with lace, of women in veils reciting Ovid while men wore antlered masks. The detail was too precise, the smell of pitch and wine too vivid to be fiction. The image traveled through London. Faster than any rumor before it, Fleet Street responded as only it could, with ink, caricature, and profit. Editors who once trimmed the words of women's diaries for fear of libel now flung whole columns into print. Aristocracy in mask cried one headline. The velvet curtain lifted, announced another. Printers worked through nights, the smell of hot oil and metal heavy in their presses. Boys cried the papers in morning streets, their voices sharp against the rumble of carriages. By noon the scandal belonged to everyone. Carpenters whistled verses as they hammered, maids repeated fragments while scrubbing steps. Bankers carried folded sheets inside ledgers, as if numbers could conceal words. The myth of privacy, once the cornerstone of the English home, collapsed under the weight of these revelations. Privacy had been praised as fortress and altar, the sacred center where virtue dwelt unassailable. Now that fortress proved stage and scenery, its curtains hiding not prayers but performances. Every portrait in the National Gallery seemed altered by suspicion. The painted lady with folded hands, once celebrated for serenity, now looked as though she waited for the curtain to rise. Trust itself faltered. For the aristocracy, the humiliation cut deeper than any before. Diaries could be dismissed as weakness, but theaters were institutions. To learn that a family had converted an entire wing into stagecraft was to realize that secrecy had become not accident but habit. Retreat could not erase what exposure revealed. Families fled to country estates. Blinds drawn, voices lowered. Others defied, arriving at balls glittering with jewels, daring gossip to name them. But neither retreat nor defiance erased the new truth. The hidden theater had replaced the angelic home. The ordinary citizens of London responded with a mixture of mockery and recognition. In markets where the air smelled of cabbage and damp straw, women read aloud fragments printed on cheap paper and laughed until tears streaked their cheeks. "They are no better than us," one said, lifting a basket heavy with potatoes. Dock workers in taverns pounded counters with calloused palms and sang ballads they invented on the spot, songs of crimson curtains and masked ladies. Bawdy and bitter, children skipped rope in alleyways chanting rhymes that carried scandal into the next generation. The city itself became chorus to the revelation. The churches thundered. Of course, pulpits resounded with denunciations of sin, of Rome, of Babylon reborn in Mayfair. Yet the very violence of these sermons betrayed unease. Congregations listened, but eyes drifted. The color crimson now belonged less to sacrifice than to scandal. Women lowered eyes, but some raised them with calm defiance, the flicker of crimson. Lamps reflected in their gaze. When the bells released the faithful into streets that smelled of coal smoke and rain, the air seemed heavier with unspoken doubt. Authority had thundered, but the echoes sounded hollow. Writers and reformers seized opportunity. Pamphlets appeared overnight, warning that hereditary privilege had rotted not only in finance, but in morality. Industrialists in Manchester cited this scandal as proof that merit must triumph over birth. Labour leaders in Glasgow proclaimed that those who preached discipline practiced indulgence. Nationalists in Dublin mocked Britain's claim to moral guardianship. Abroad, colonial journalists wrote with grim amusement that the empire, which judged the customs of others, had theaters of its own. Moral authority, once exported like a polished commodity, now returned to London cracked and doubtful. The scandal also transformed art and literature. Playwrights who had long skirted censors began to write dramas more daring, their characters whispering lines that audiences recognized as commentary on aristocratic masquerades. Painters filled canvases with ambiguous figures, women in veils, men in masks, so that galleries seemed to echo with suggestion. Even music halls borrowed imagery, their singers dressed in crimson and lace. Audiences roared with laughter, but the laughter carried knowledge. Every note, every brushstroke was shadowed by scandal. More quietly, within homes far removed from aristocratic stages, the scandal reshaped conversation. In a small house in Clerkenwell, a clerk's wife set down her teacup and asked her husband why ladies of rank should be judged more gently than women of her class. In a boarding house near Paddington, young seamstresses gathered after work. There, fingers sore from needle and thread, and read scraps of newspapers. They spoke softly of the possibility that desire was not sin but nature. Such talk, though fragile, carried hope, even in kitchens where gas lamps hissed and bread baked in iron ovens. The scandal lent words to thoughts long unspoken. Even the theatres of the city, once guarded by strict censors, began to echo with bolder laughter. A comic actor at Drury Lane slipped a line into his performance. "Beware the crimson curtain, gentlemen, for it hides more than a play." The audience erupted, half in shock, half in glee. The line was stricken the next night, but the memory lingered. In coffeehouses, men argued whether art imitated scandal or scandal imitated art. The very boundaries between stage and street blurred. London itself seemed a theatre. Its fog the curtain, its carriages the shifting scenery, its citizens unwilling actors in a national performance. The result extended beyond scandal into transformation. Theatres hidden within houses proved that repression did not eliminate desire, it reshaped it into spectacle. Privacy was not shield but disguise, and once the disguise was stripped, the performance became universal property. The empire still commanded fleets and armies, yet it could no longer command respect with unchallenged certainty. Moral innocence, once worn like a halo, lay shattered. The velvet curtain had lifted, and the stage remained in plain view. Lady Margaret's phrase, recorded years earlier in the quiet of her diary, "I felt alive for an hour," took on new meaning. It no longer spoke of solitary rebellion. It described a society itself. For 1 hour, in theatres hidden behind the facades of Mayfair, the nation saw its own reflection. That reflection was scandalous, yes, but also undeniable. It revealed that angels were flesh, that repression breeds performance, and that truth, once revealed, cannot be folded away like curtains. The result was not merely scandal, but transformation, a recognition that secrecy, once unmasked, becomes part of history's stage. The revelation that entire houses had been turned into hidden theatres startled London. But such creations did not spring from thin air. They were the harvest of forces that had pressed on society for decades. To understand why velvet curtains parted in Mayfair and masquerades unfolded in basements, one must look closely at the immediate causes: repression, wealth, servants, fashion, art, boredom, and the hunger of a city eager for spectacle. Repression stood first among causes. Victorian society wrote more sermons on virtue than any age before it. Churches rang with homilies on chastity. Schools drilled young women in modesty until it weighed on them like armor. A girl of 12 copied verses into her copybook beneath the stern gaze of her governess, the ink smelling sharp as iron. By 20, she was married to a man who carried his own amusements into clubs and brothels while she was left to preside. Over dinners, the demand was impossible. She must be angel and ornament, silent yet inspiring, graceful yet obedient. In that contradiction, the seed of rebellion grew. Wealth provided another cause. Aristocrats commanded resources beyond imagination for most citizens. A merchant might save for years to purchase a piano. A duke could fill a hall with instruments for an evening's masquerade. Money made indulgence not only possible, but aesthetic. Curtains from Italy, rugs from Persia, incense from Arabia, objects that elsewhere marked trade became in London the raw materials of hidden stages. The ability to transform space itself was the luxury of the few, and they exercised it with abandon. Servants played a paradoxical role. They were indispensable, polishing mirrors until they reflected lamps like fire, tending braziers, arranging costumes. Yet they were also witnesses. A maid carrying trays of wine into a disguised ballroom saw more than she was meant to see. A coachman waiting outside at dawn heard laughter drift through open windows and smelled incense mixed with coal smoke. Their silence was bought, but silence is fragile. Dismissed servants carried their knowledge to taverns, to neighbors, sometimes to Fleet Street. Each hidden theater rested upon the secrecy of those who had the least reason to keep secrets. Fashion, too, lent itself to transformation. The gowns of society, heavy with lace and pearl, already carried theatricality. A lady stepping into a ballroom was halfway to performance. Theatrical costumes required little invention. A mask, a cloak, a ribbon tied in a new place, fashion blurred into role, and role into spectacle. What began as display at a dance became to blow in a private hall. The very garments designed to display obedience were reimagined as instruments of defiance. Lace that once softened modest gowns now bound wrists. Jewels that had proclaimed rank now glittered as props in improvised scenes. Art and literature provided justification. The age had grown enamored of myth and anthropology. Journals described ceremonies in distant lands. Museums displayed artifacts behind glass. Poets wrote of gods and masks. Aristocrats borrowed these fragments for their theaters. A Mask of Diana echoed lectures heard at the Royal Institution. Scenes of chained nymphs reflected engravings studied in libraries. The hidden theaters clothed desire in scholarship, claiming inspiration from antiquity and science even as they indulged the body. The hunger of the city magnified everything. London in the 1890s was a place where rumor moved faster than trains. Fleet Street thrived on sensation. Each whisper that a lady had painted scenery in her attic or that a lord had hired actors. For his basement became currency. Editors dangled coins before servants. Printers asked no questions if paper sold. The city itself demanded performance, and aristocrats obliged, half fearing, half courting exposure. In this way, the public became a partner in the very spectacles it pretended to condemn. Boredom offered another cause. For all their power, many aristocrats lived in a cage of ritual. Dinners, hunts, balls, endless repetition of appearances. Life at the top could grow weary. Some sought escape in politics, others in travel, but many turned inward, inventing dramas to break the monotony. Theaters in drawing rooms were not only indulgence, they were antidote to tedium. Curtains rising in Mayfair were as much about relief as about rebellion. There were also subtler causes. Advances in technology brought new lamps, brighter and more flexible, able to cast crimson or sapphire light at the turn of a knob. Sheet music for foreign dances circulated cheaply, and with it came rhythms unknown to earlier generations. A London household with wealth could borrow the world's colors and sounds. These novelties, harmless in themselves, became bricks in the construction of secret theaters. Even the servants' quarters, often cramped and smelling of soap and coal dust, contributed. Maids whispered of what they had seen, a lamp shaded in red, a box of masks arriving from a foreign shop, a delivery of costumes wrapped in paper. These whispers carried up and down staircases, into kitchens and laundries, into the ears of butlers who both protected and betrayed their masters. Such knowledge created tension. Secrecy depended upon those with least power. In time, resentment found outlets in rumor, and rumor built the stages higher than any architect had planned. One may add yet another cause: the appetite for novelty among audiences themselves. The theaters of the city had long been censored, their stages policed for impropriety. When news spread that aristocrats mounted private dramas with mythological disguises, curiosity only grew. Ordinary people felt cheated, forced to watch Baudelaireized plays while lords enacted bacchanals. This envy stoked gossip's fire. A cobbler in Holborn said bitterly, "They preach restraint and then rent actors." Such words echoed through taverns and alleyways, feeding a public appetite for every new detail. And there was the role of the press itself as creator as much as reporter. A single column of speculation could set imaginations racing. An editor, eager for sales, might embellish a servant's tale with details never witnessed. The public devoured each line, and in doing so, made the theaters more real, more desirable. Rumor created fact, and fact created rumor in a circle without end. Aristocrats who had staged only modest entertainments found themselves suspected of grand spectacles, and in the shadow of suspicion, often proceeded to make the suspicion real. Taken together, these causes formed a web. Repression demanded secrecy. Wealth supplied means. Servants offered both service and danger. Fashion blurred into performance. Art gave vocabulary. The press supplied audience. Boredom pressed for novelty. And curiosity of the crowd ensured circulation. From such elements, the hidden theaters arose. They were not accidents, but inevitabilities, written in the very fabric of Victorian life. The scandal, when exposed, shocked only those who had refused to see. London had built the conditions. The aristocracy merely arranged them into scenes. And so the theaters, far from being aberrations, were revelations of what the age had made unavoidable. The hidden theaters had long existed behind the facades of London townhouses. Yet the turning point came when secrecy spilled into daylight. A single dismissal, a single betrayal, and a private masquerade became public matter. From that moment, the scandal could not be contained. It was no longer rumor or caricature. It was documented, named, and printed, a fact upon which the nation had to look. It began, as so much did, with a servant. A footman dismissed without references carried with him memories of velvet curtains and painted scenery. One cold evening he walked through the fog of Fleet Street, clutching a packet of pages taken from a waste bin. They smelled faintly of wax and incense. He sold them to a reporter hungry for anything that might stir circulation. The paper published a description of a masque of Bacchus, said to have been performed in a Belgravia mansion. The words were careful, yet the suggestion unmistakable. At first the aristocracy scoffed. A baronet declared in his club that the story was absurd. A duchess laughed behind her fan at the notion of painted scenery. But their denial came too swiftly, and denial itself became confession. When the next issue appeared with testimony from a dismissed maid who described crimson lamps and mirrored walls, silence followed. The press had crossed a boundary. Theaters were no longer private rumor. They were public spectacle. The turning point sharpened when art itself became entangled. A painter exhibited at the Royal Academy a canvas showing veiled women before a stage of ivy and stone. Critics whispered that the image was too close to scandal to be coincidence. Crowds thronged the gallery, some to sneer, others to marvel. When asked, the painter claimed innocence, yet the timing betrayed him. Art and scandal had merged, one feeding the other. London discovered that hidden theatres were not apart from culture, but at its centre. Parliament could not remain silent. A member rose to denounce the press for indecency, declaring that rumour should not masquerade as fact. Another, with sarcasm, asked whether gentlemen in the chamber had never attended a private performance themselves. Laughter followed, bitter and thin. Authority was weakened. The law that had once guarded privacy now seemed complicit in deception. The turning point was not merely scandalous detail. It was the collapse of immunity. Churches thundered, yet even sermons betrayed unease. A bishop preached that sin had been revealed so that virtue might triumph. But his congregation shifted in their pews, the smell of damp wool filling the nave. Women listened with faces calm, but in their hearts some felt a quiet solidarity. Men listened with rigid posture, fearing what diaries or servants might reveal. The turning point lay not only in exposure, but in recognition. Everyone understood that the scandal was plausible. Because repression had long made it inevitable, the press pushed further. Reporters bribed stable boys, laundresses, even deliverymen. One story described a tailor summoned to a mansion to repair torn costumes. Another told of musicians hired for an evening, instructed to play while curtains parted on scenes of myth. Each account deepened the sense that theaters were not exception, but habit. The city could not laugh away what detail made undeniable. For the aristocracy, the turning point was humiliation. Some withdrew, fleeing to country estates, where hedges and distance might shield them. Others confronted scandal with bravado, hosting balls glittering with jewels, daring Fleet Street to name them outright. Yet both retreat and defiance revealed the same truth. Secrecy was broken. Theaters that had lived on silence now lived in rumor, and rumor had become evidence. Families that had ruled for generations felt their authority waver on the page of a newspaper. Among ordinary citizens, the turning point bred both delight and bitterness. In taverns, dockworkers sang verses mocking crimson lamps. Women in markets chuckled as they read aloud fragments from cheap papers. The smell of fish and straw mingling with laughter. But beneath amusement lay resentment. "They play while we toil," a seamstress said. Folding her rough hands, the scandal confirmed inequality even as it blurred the line of virtue. If the guardians of morality lived in masquerade, who was left to preach restraint? The city itself became theater. Caricatures appeared in shop windows, showing lords in masks, ladies draped in lace, servants peering through curtains. Crowds gathered to laugh, but each laugh carried unease. Children skipped rope chanting rhymes about crimson rooms, carrying scandal into alleys and schoolyards. London, from palace to slum, became chorus to the revelation. The turning point was not one event, but the moment when scandal permeated every corner. One evening, Edwin Harrow, the journalist who had exposed earlier diaries, walked along the embankment. Fog curled thick around the lamps, and the river smelled of damp stone. He thought of Lady Margaret's words, "I felt alive for an hour," and realized they now described the city itself. For 1 hour, London had seen its reflection, vivid and undeniable. That reflection could not be erased. He knew that history had shifted. The hidden theaters, once secret, now belonged to the record. The turning point carried consequence beyond. Britain, in Paris, newspapers mocked English hypocrisy. In Dublin, nationalists seized the scandal as proof of corruption. In Calcutta, journalists wrote that the empire, which judged foreign customs, could not govern its own moral authority. Once exported as confidently as textiles and steel, now returned tarnished. The revelation of hidden theaters weakened more than families. It weakened empire. What made this the turning point was not the scale of the scandal, but its undeniability. Rumor could be laughed at, caricature dismissed. But when servants spoke, when art hinted, when papers printed, when laughter spread across classes, secrecy ended. The velvet curtain had lifted, and the stage beneath was visible to all. From that moment forward, the aristocracy could not return to the innocence of pretense. Theaters once hidden had become metaphors for the age itself. Thus, the turning point arrived quietly yet irrevocably. It was not a single headline, nor a single dismissal, but the accumulation of detail until denial collapsed. London discovered that repression breeds spectacle, and spectacle, once revealed, reshapes power. From that moment, the city stood changed. Authority had been mocked, privacy pierced, and truth made public. The hidden theaters were no longer private indulgence. They were history's stage. The scandal of the hidden theaters did not remain within the walls of aristocratic mansions. Once the curtains had been pulled aside by rumor and print, the echoes spread outward into every corner of society. The reverberations touched taverns and markets, parlors and churches, even distant colonies that read English papers with mingled shock and amusement. What had been private masquerade became public atmosphere, a climate of suspicion and fascination that enveloped the empire. In the taverns of the East End, where the smell of stale beer clung to the rafters and sawdust muffled footsteps, dockworkers leaned against counters to hear the latest fragments. A man with rope-scarred palms read aloud from a cheap newspaper, his voice halting but firm. The words described velvet curtains and women in veils reciting lines of myth. Laughter erupted, sharp and bitter. "So they call us unruly," one muttered, slamming his mug. The scandal confirmed what the poor had long believed. Virtue was a costume, worn by the privileged while they mocked the discipline expected of others. In the parlors of Belgravia, the mood was tighter, quieter, more suffocating. Ladies lifted, Fans with trembling fingers, whispering behind painted feathers. Husbands read newspapers by the glow of the fire and folded them with excessive care, as though gentleness with paper might erase its words. Dinners grew subdued. Guests looked uneasily at portraits hanging on paneled walls, wondering what truths those serene faces might conceal. The scandal poisoned the air with suspicion. Privacy itself had become a stage upon which everyone feared discovery. Fleet Street roared with energy. Printers worked until dawn, their presses hissing with hot oil, their air thick with the metallic smell of ink. Editors discovered that innuendo sold as well as fact. Caricatures of masked lords and veiled ladies appeared in shop windows, drawing. Crowds that laughed while stealing glances over shoulders. Yet beneath the laughter lay unease. When the powerful become entertainment, power itself is diminished. Each fresh column widened the gulf between appearance and trust. Reformers seized the opportunity. Pamphlets declared hereditary privilege corrupt in body as well as in purse. Industrialists in Manchester pointed to the scandal as proof that merit, not birth, should govern progress. Labour leaders in Glasgow invoked it to show that those who preached discipline practiced indulgence. Nationalists in Dublin mocked Britain's moral pretensions. Abroad, colonial journalists reprinted stories with grim satisfaction. An Indian writer noted that Britain scolded native customs while indulging its own theatre of secrecy. Within the aristocracy, division deepened. Some families withdrew to country estates, their blinds drawn, their names absent from guest lists. Others confronted scandal with defiance, attending balls as if to challenge the press to name them outright. But in both retreat and defiance lurked the same fear. The mask no longer fit. Trust between friends frayed. A lady hesitated before confiding in her companion, afraid her words might someday find print. A lord eyed his valet with suspicion, aware that silence could not be bought forever. Among ordinary Londoners, fascination mixed with recognition. Seamstresses bent over candlelight read paragraphs aloud, their fingers pricked with needles, and whispered that noble women were not so different after all. Dock workers composed ballads that mocked crimson lamps. Children in alleyways invented rhymes that carried scandal into their play. The affair blurred lines of class by uniting rich and poor in judgment of those above them. Yet it also unsettled. If even the guardians of virtue failed, what standard remained for anyone? For women, the reverberations were complex. Some felt shame, as if the exposure of noble women tainted their sex. Others felt solidarity, sensing that diaries and theatres had given voice to desires long buried. A school teacher in Brighton confessed in her journal that she trembled while reading Lady Margaret's words. But she also felt courage kindle. A farmer's wife in Yorkshire whispered over a borrowed paper that angels were flesh after all. The scandal gave language, however whispered, to women who had lacked the words for longing. Even Parliament absorbed the shock. Beneath gaslight arches, members argued fiercely. Some demanded censorship of the press. Others mocked the idea as futile. One member jested that if every diary and servant's tale were censored, the libraries of London would be empty. Laughter rang thin and nervous. Authority discovered its limits. Privacy, once untouchable, had become porous. The churches rang louder, yet their sermons carried less conviction. Preachers thundered that God had unveiled sin, but congregations heard only that secrecy was fragile. Parishioners left with hymns in their ears, but questions in their hearts. Their shoes striking wet pavement while horse hooves splashed in the gutters. The bells tolled, but the toll was hollow. The Empire, too, trembled. In Calcutta, a newspaper reprinted Fleet Street columns with dry commentary. The rulers lecture our customs while enacting their own. In Cape Town, missionaries struggled to maintain authority when congregants quoted scandalous headlines back at them. In Dublin, nationalist meetings cheered when speakers mocked Britain's hypocrisy. Moral authority, once Britain's strongest export, was now in question. The reverberations stretched from drawing rooms to colonies, a wave traveling farther than any rumor had before. Artists felt the tremor. Painters filled canvases with masked figures and veiled faces, galleries humming. With suggestion, playwrights slipped sharper lines into their scripts, knowing audiences would hear echoes of scandal. Even music halls borrowed imagery, singers costumed in crimson and lace. Crowds roared, laughing and wincing at once. Art became mirror as well as magnifier. The scandal was no longer confined to rumor. It had seeped into culture itself. In courtrooms, too, the echoes rang. A defense attorney argued that jurors should beware hypocrisy when judging petty theft, for even the mighty sinned behind curtains. Judges frowned, but the gallery murmured assent. Law, like church, found its authority shaken. Street life carried its own vibrations. Newsboys shouted headlines into the fog, their voices cracking above the clatter of hooves. Women at market stalls argued over details as fiercely as over the price of bread. In coffee houses near universities, students debated whether scandal revealed hypocrisy or human nature. Each setting, whether humble or learned, vibrated with the same disquiet. The city seemed to breathe the scandal with every gust of coal dusted. Air. Universities, too, absorbed the shock. Lecturers in moral philosophy faced restless halls as students demanded answers. Was virtue a mask? Was secrecy inevitable in power? At Oxford, one undergraduate scribbled in his notebook that Lady Margaret's diary mattered more than Aristotle that week. Young minds, quick to question, carried the reverberations into the next century. Thus the reverberations spread from markets to ministries, from parlors to provinces. They revealed how fragile the edifice of virtue had been, and how swiftly the theater of secrecy could become theater for a nation. The scandal was not merely a story of hidden chambers. It was a mirror in which society glimpsed itself and could not look away. The scandal of the hidden theaters might seem a curiosity confined to the last decade of the 19th century. Yet its echoes persist into the present. Though crimson lamps have dimmed and velvet curtains decayed, the questions they raised about secrecy, power, repression, and desire still trouble us. To understand the present, one must return to those chambers where the aristocracy rehearsed their desires, and where society glimpsed itself unmasked. The echoes of that exposure ring in our own time, not as novelty, but as warning. The first echo lies in the fragility of privacy. Victorians believed their homes impregnable. Yet diaries betrayed them and theatres exposed them. A drawing room thought inviolate could be transformed into stage, and a servant's memory could become testimony. In our own age, privacy is no less fragile. The velvet curtain is now a screen, lit not by gas lamps but by cold electric glow. Secrets meant for private eyes become public in moments. A message sent in haste, a photograph stored without thought, can reach millions overnight. The echo is unmistakable. Power still hides behind performance. But performance is fragile. The scandal also speaks to inequality. Dock workers laughed bitterly at the sight of lords in masks, for they saw hypocrisy confirmed. They labored in soot and sweat while noblemen adorned themselves in myth. Today, inequality breeds similar laughter and resentment. Corporate towers gleam above streets where workers struggle, and each revelation of indulgence at the top rekindles anger below. Theatres of Mayfair remind us that privilege does not protect morality. If anything, privilege tempts its holders to spectacle. The echo is cautionary, urging vigilance in every age. Memory lingers in art. Painters who once slipped veiled figures onto canvas left behind an inheritance of ambiguity. Their colors, sepia and crimson, continue to haunt galleries. Modern artists, though freed from censorship, still play with masks and hidden rooms, drawing unconsciously from that lineage. Literature, too, continues the echo. The novels of our time probe secrecy and desire, borrowing imagery of curtains, stages, and masquerades. Each book that asks whether identity is performance rehearses again the old scandal. Politics carries its own reverberation. In 1890s London, Parliament squirmed under laughter when members hinted that even lawmakers attended secret plays. Today, parliaments and congresses face the same peril: exposure of private indulgence. That undermines public authority. Scandals of expenses, of secret meetings, of leaked correspondence all recall the moment when velvet curtains were pulled aside. Authority, then as now, is vulnerable not only to failure in governance, but to hypocrisy unmasked. Citizens are less forgiving of pretense than of error. The echo reaches even into the intimate. Lady Margaret's words, "I felt alive for an hour," resonate still. They remind us that beneath discipline and routine lies a hunger that will not be erased. Each generation faces its own struggle between repression and expression. Whether whispered in diaries, enacted in theaters, or confessed online, the truth emerges. The scandal reminds us that to deny desire is to invite performance, and performance, once revealed, alters power. The young woman who posted a confession on a midnight forum is sister to the noblewoman who wrote trembling lines in her journal. Consider the streets of modern London. The smell is no longer of coal smoke, but of petrol and rain. Neon lights replace gas lamps, but the rhythm of exposure remains the same. Newsboys no longer cry headlines. Instead, screens in railway stations flash them in bold letters. Yet the effect is identical. The city becomes chorus to revelation. In 1895, children skipped rote chanting of crimson rooms. In 2025, they repeat memes, laughing in classrooms. What changes is form, not substance. Humanity delights in rumor, recoils at exposure, and reshapes itself in response. The reverberations also continue abroad, just as colonial journalists once mocked British hypocrisy. So now the world notes when nations preach virtue while hiding theaters of their own. A century ago, an Indian editor wrote with dry wit that Britain scolded native customs while indulging in masquerades at home. Today, the same irony appears when global media exposes secrecy of those who govern. While preaching transparency, the scandal of secrecy, once Mayfair's burden, has become universal. Global media ensures that exposure travels farther and faster than any Fleet Street Boys cry. And yet, amid caution, there lies comfort. The scandal showed that revelation, though painful, was cleansing. Victorian sermons thundered of sin, but ordinary people heard instead a truth. The mighty were human. That recognition, unsettling as it was, carried relief. Today, too, exposure brings paradox. When leaders are unmasked, trust in institutions may falter, but trust in common humanity may deepen. We recognize ourselves in the faltering of the great. We recall that angels are flesh, that masks conceal fear as much as desire. The echo also shapes education. In universities, students debate not only Aristotle and Locke, but also the diaries of Lady Margaret and the caricatures of Fleet Street. Professors note that history's scandals teach as effectively as its treaties. Young minds discover that the past is not remote, it is mirror. A student scrolling headlines of data leaks feels kinship with a maid whispering tales of crimson lamps. Both inhabit societies where secrecy collapses and truth escapes into public air. The lesson is stern, repression is temporary, but exposure is permanent. The artistic echo is vivid in theater itself. Directors stage modern plays that deliberately invoke veils and masks, crimson light and whispered confessions. Audiences, though perhaps unaware of Victorian precedent, respond with unease and fascination. They recognize in the stage the paradox that defined Mayfair's masquerades, that we reveal ourselves most clearly when pretending to be other than we are. Every ovation, every silence before the curtain falls, participates in the echo of scandal. As we reflect, the echo widens into philosophy. The scandal asks us whether morality is possible without honesty, whether repression sustains virtue or corrodes it. Victorian London discovered that masks cannot hold forever. We discover it again each time a secret collapses under the weight of exposure. The hidden theaters stand as warning and guide. To live authentically is safer, however painful, than to live behind velvet curtains. Thus the hidden theaters, though silent, speak still. They warn against hypocrisy. They remind us of inequality. They urge compassion for desire. And they teach that truth, though painful, is cleansing. The velvet curtains have fallen into dust, but their echo endures in our world of glass and light. The scandal of Mayfair is not past. It is present, repeated each time secrecy unravels. We read it in headlines, we see it in art, we feel it in our private fears. The 19th century whispers still in our century, telling us that performance cannot remain hidden forever. If you are still awake, press 1 in the comments. The story of the hidden theatres of the Victorian aristocracy has carried us from velvet-curtained chambers in Mayfair to the crowded alleys of modern life. We began with discovery servants whispering, reporters scribbling, caricaturists sketching, lords and ladies in masks. We watched as secrecy collapsed and laughter turned to judgment, as authority faltered and hypocrisy was unveiled. From there we followed the reverberations through Parliament, churches, taverns, and colonies abroad, until this scandal reached even our present reflections. Now, as we close this chapter, we find ourselves gazing not merely backward but inward. The scandal of the hidden theatres was never only about the aristocracy. It was, and remains, about the frailty of human nature. Behind masks of lace or behind glowing screens, we carry the same longing, the same struggle between desire and duty, secrecy and revelation. The velvet curtains may have fallen to dust, but the questions they concealed continue to glow like embers beneath ash. Picture the silence of a Mayfair drawing room, once heavy with incense, now layered with dust. Imagine the echo of voices that once laughed in disguise, their sound fading but not lost. That echo persists in every headline that reveals corruption, in every work of art that hints at the masks we wear, in every private confession that escapes into the world. The past is not past. It is woven into our present, stitched like threads of gold and shadow into the fabric of our lives. And so, dear listener, what have we learned? Perhaps that repression breeds performance, and performance, once revealed, reshapes power. Perhaps that no society can thrive on hypocrisy, for eventually servants will speak, diaries will be read, and curtains will be drawn. Perhaps, too, that exposure, though painful, cleanses, for when the mighty fall from illusion to humanity, we are reminded that frailty is shared, and in that recognition lies both humility and hope. As we turn the final page, let us not close the book with despair. History offers not only warnings, but companionship. We see ourselves reflected in those who came before, and we know we are not alone in our contradictions. The hidden theatres remind us that secrecy may endure for a season, but truth, like dawn, rises inevitably. And when it rises, we stand together in its light, chastened but also renewed. Leave a 1 if you are still awake, and don't forget to subscribe to join me on the next journey.